This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Finally, after an extended sojourn, back in the saddle, back in Asia, back in Ho Chi Minh City, back in Saigon. As I recuperate and recover from a little jet lag, please enjoy 4 episodes back to back to back to back. A little risk management, a little liberty, a little metrics, and a little sleep. By the way, as a complete side tangent, there is a melatonin that you can buy at CVS that is the bomb. I'll have to post a picture. I don't really have any sleep issues, but occasionally when I travel, I'll try anything to get over jet lag. And many times when I've tried melatonin, you feel like you're hungover the next day. This stuff I've found is great. Product placement over. Let's jump right into 4 episodes. Like I said, a little risk management, a little liberty, a little metrics, and a lot of sleep. I hope you enjoy. My guest today, Aaron Brown, an American finance practitioner, author, expert, risk management, gambling-related issues. Most famously known as the former chief risk manager at AQR Capital Management, one of the biggest funds in the world, I believe north of $100 billion. You have to think that if Cliff Aston signed off on hiring Aaron Brown, there must be something interesting about this guy, even if we've not read his books or know anything about him. And oh, by the way, if you want to check out something kind of cool, the MIT Educational Forum with Aaron Brown, where he discusses the history of poker. There you go. Send me your thank you in email for that one alone. To listen to Aaron describe something like a simple card game and the history of America and how it all ties together. Really cool stuff. Today, I take Aaron on my podcast around the risk landscape, picking and prodding his mind as much as I can to get him to give me as much as he will. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Aaron Brown. So, so many people, Aaron, they want to be the quant, but it's kind of an odd thing where people, they want to be this great sounding term, but not many people are comfortable with an occupation where you really might not know more than 51%, are they?
Well, let me take a slightly discursive answer to that. The word was originally an insult. And that was from like mid to late 90s. And then it got kind of adopted defiantly, kind of like gay people decided they were queer. And then suddenly it became cool and popular. But yes, it is not a way most people want to live. And it's not a question of math ability. You can't have zero math ability to be a quant, but lots of people have all the math ability. They just don't have the personality. My personal definition of quant is someone who makes calculations and bets on them. And there are a lot more people who want to make calculations than who want to bet on them.
That probably gets at my next direction I really want to go is, why have so many people wanted you? I mean, and I think you might have just answered it there as you can do the calculations and make the bets. But why have so many people wanted you over your career? What is it about your personality that drives them to come to you?
Yeah, it's not my personality. I'm pretty sure about that. Well, I'll tell you something Paul Wilmot said about me that I think he might have meant as an insult. I'm not sure, but that I've always treasured. He said, Aaron Brown can solve any problem for which a solution is known to exist. And I never quite figured out why he said that or what specifically he meant. But that is my talent, that I don't tackle problems where I'm not sure a solution exists, where, people are going to argue about what the solution should be. I like things where when you find a solution, it is. And, there has to be a solution. That's why I like applied math rather than pure math. And that turns out to be valuable in the financial world.
You just said something about people not liking your personality. Maybe you didn't phrase it that way, or you said it's not your personality. But, I've had a chance to kind of sit with you on some of your presentations online, and there's a certain passion there. There's a certain gleam in your eye where you just, you can feel the love for this content. So are you sure people aren't really attracted to something there beyond just the skill set?
Well, probably. Actually, I guess I put it two ways. I have always been in groups with people like, Nassim Taleb and Paul Wilmot and, sort of Emmanuel Derman, people who kind of think like me. And I get along with them well and have a lot of contacts and opportunities through that. But the people who have hired me, the people I've worked for, typically are not that kind of person, typically would prefer somebody who did what I did with a different way of going about it, I think.
Define that so we can kind of, I didn't even know we were going to go in this path, but we kind of open it up. You talk about, I've had Emmanuel on this podcast, and obviously we all know of Nassim Taleb. You talk about having this fondness for the interaction with those men, and I can appreciate that immediately, which tells me a lot about you. But the people that hire you, it seems like that conversation you'd be having with Emmanuel and Nassim would be the reason they would want to hire you. But what do they want to do different once they hire you?
Well, I think actually we kind of set it up pretty well. Everybody loves Emmanuel. I won't say everybody hates Nassim, but
he has sharp elbows.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Call me halfway in between. I've never managed to be as gracious or as popular as Emmanuel, but I've managed to avoid making as many enemies as Nassim.
But what do you think, though, really, when you say that when people hire you, they want something different? Do you feel like you're like put into a box at that point in time and you just have to deliver some kind of skill set, of course, that you have? Is it they don't want the philosophical? What is it that they're trying to change or don't like?
The stuff I do is inherently disruptive. One of the weird things about our world, people 1,000 years from now look back on our society. I think the weirdest thing the thing they're going to find hardest to understand is why we allocate power according to claimed ability to deal with risk, either to anticipate what's going to happen, to predict what's going to happen, or to deal with it as it arises. And we never actually test it, So we have all these leaders who tell you exactly what's going to happen and exactly what we should do. And we don't really keep track to see if they're right. And of course, they're not. And so when you come in and you start doing these quantitative things and say, okay, this thing you thought was your core competency that was making a lot of money is really no better than random, or that we've been making an awful lot of bets that have low probability but high impact negative outcomes that you've been unaware of. That's not easy to hear, and that disrupts things. Powerful people lose their base of power. Things have to change. Sometimes money has to be given up. Opportunities have to be given up. There are people like Emmanuel who manage to work at a place like Goldman Sachs and communicate that and get people to change without causing offense. And then there are people like Nassim Taleb who live to cause offense. I'm kind of more neutral about it. Here's the facts. If it's disruptive, it's disruptive. That's not my problem. Here's what the facts. Here's what we have to do. And you guys figure out, who's going to get the credit and the blame and so on. I want to go back to my office and think about the next problem.
I've seen you say it. So Wall Street is really, I don't think people really think about this clearly, but Wall Street is about sales. It's about selling something. So I guess if you walk into a room of people that ultimately, regardless of title, net worth, etc., if you walk into a room full of people that make their money by sales and you are telling the truth, I guess a couple slings and arrows will occasionally come your way, huh?
Yeah, and and there are ways to phrase it in a sales-friendly way, but I've never troubled to do it. I don't think it's so much I'm bad. I honestly don't care, and I probably could do a better job if I tried, but it's not a lack of skill so much as a personality. Like, I don't want to argue about it. I don't want you to tell me, how this is going to mess up our sales. I'm telling you, this product should not be sold. And, you guys can do with that whatever you will.
You care about the direction you're going down, the research, the truth that you figured out. You just don't care about whatever constraints have to go along with the sales operation.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Finance has always been sales. That's what's rewarded. That's what it's about. The fact that those sales have to be constrained by a little reality. I might compare myself a little bit to an equity analyst. Equity analysts write reports, and they also try to tell the truth, but they are very, very attuned to the sales implications of what they say, both to the issuer side, the security issuer side, and to the investor side. And they get very good at that, and therefore they work well with salespeople. I could never be an equity analyst. I was offered a job once as an equity analyst, and I figured out immediately that I could not do it.
Okay, let me take you back in time. So we're talking about kind of current day and looking back in history, looking back throughout your career, talking about working with various Wall Street firms. I want to know, place me a date, a time, an age for you where you first had that wrap your arms around the idea and thinking in terms of odds, appreciating chance. Oh, look, there's uncertainty. Risk. Give me an age, the event, something, the person, the trigger, the book, the mentor. When did that start for you?
I may have been born with that. And if I wasn't, it probably came about from reading Beat the Dealer back when I was 8 or 9 years old by Ed Thorpe. I just always thought that way. There were two great revelations, two sort of elaborations of that belief. The first was at age 14 when I realized I could walk into a commercial poker game. I could sit down, I could win. I knew I could win. That was never an issue. And people would let me walk out with the money.
How did that make you feel, though? You could walk out with the money. You just kind of went by that fast. 14 years old, you're beating grown men, and you could walk out with the money. How did that feel?
That was very important to me for various reasons. So I'm 61 years old. So we're talking about 1970 and Seattle, the recession of the 70s, the bad malaise of the 70s kind of hit Seattle a couple of years earlier than the rest of the country. And things felt very insecure. The idea of getting a job seemed, very insecure. And it seemed like money was really important and that you couldn't count on, any of the traditional things. There's inflation seemed out of control, hyperinflation, taxes seemed, very high and very unpredictable and so on. And, it just seemed like a very complicated world that was very scary. And poker was pretty simple. You walked in, you bet your money, you got your money, you walked out. And that's why I was attracted to it. I was also attracted to sports betting, to horse racing, and so on. But those were more difficult for me to access at that age. Poker, there was no age requirement because technically all of it was illegal, but nobody really cared. They couldn't enforce age restrictions like they could at the racetrack. And so it was very important to me. And I realized when I walked out there, I said, okay, I don't know what's going to happen in life, but I know I can always, get enough money to eat today, to get a place to stay for the night, whatever, because there's always poker anywhere in the world. All you have to do is find a game. And if you're a good player, even if you have no money, somebody will lend you a stake. You got guaranteed income for life. And that bit of security has always been very important to me. Far more important than things like having an income, having wealth, assets. Those things can all kind of disappear. But the ability to make your own money in a self-organized way without external rules, without counting on some government or company or a set of rules other than the sort of poker player network. So that's when I decided, okay, I can make a living exploiting chance, exploiting bets.
We won't go there today, but I want to implore the audience to check out your MIT presentation, easily found on YouTube, where you kind of explore the history of poker. It's an hour-long plus presentation, really worth checking out. It's one of those aha moments where you just kind of go, oh, wow, I did not know that,
Thank you. But then the second one is, okay, so now we're going, and I go off to college and pay my way through with poker and also doing some sports betting, doing some blackjack stuff and whatever. Let's say, late 70s. So now I'm, my early 20s. It hits me that, it's a lot easier. There's a lot more money to be made, and the gambling is a lot easier on Wall Street than in Las Vegas. That was a daring thought at the time. There weren't mathematicians on Wall Street. If you want to get a Wall Street job and you happen to take some math courses, you left them off your resume. As we said earlier, Wall Street was all about sales, and nobody wanted any math in any of it. But I started looking at the things. I read Beat the Market by Ed Thorpe. I read a lot of other stuff. And I thought, okay, the edges are a lot bigger on Wall Street, and the amount you can bet and get paid are much larger. Gambling for a living, if you do it on your own, if you don't join with a group, if you don't sort of start a business of some sort, if you're just doing it on your own, it's hard to make more than, I would say, in modern dollars, let's say $500,000, $600,000 a year. Back in those days, that would have been more like $150,000 a year. And, that's great. You can live on that. You can live pretty well if you're a single young guy and all you want to do is, have beer and a big TV set and go out to the casino. Wall Street was orders of magnitude more opportunity, more profit. So then we go, I would say it would be 1982 when I realized that this stuff really works. It's not just theory. You always kind of feel in the back of your mind that, well, they've got some trick. That can't be as easy as it looks. They have to know something I don't. When quants first came to Wall Street, so this is late 70s, early 80s, I was kind of, 3 or 4 years after the first people who did this. We were regarded just as, one more group to help the sales. If you come to Wall Street and you say, I want to make money with astrology, I want to make money, by asking my dog what stocks to buy and see which ones he barks, they love you because as far as they're concerned, your job is to go out and raise money from investors and pay fees on your trades, and they don't care at all whether your trades work or don't work. Makes no difference. Your job is to gather assets and generate commissions. And it took them until really the mid to late 80s, and some of them still haven't figured it out today, that the quants were different because the quants actually made money. And when you actually make money, that whole sales model of taking commissions from both sides and nobody ever actually making any money, just going back and forth, doesn't work. It's very similar to what casinos, figured out. Casinos really didn't like the game of poker because, in other casino games, any money the player loses, the casino wins. It's very upsetting to casinos to know that somebody in the building is making money and it's not coming from them, or somebody else is losing money and they're not getting it. Wall Street was just as unprepared for it as casinos weren't prepared for poker, that there were people out there making money, consistently winning strategies. So that's when the quant era really began. That's when people started taking it seriously. That's when people started making up the name quant as an insult. You didn't need the insult before because you didn't care enough about them. It's only when people started realizing how important we were that they had to give us a pejorative name.
I want to stay at something for a moment and let you elaborate a little bit more on it because you've mentioned it several times, starting at 8 or 9 years of age. Beat the dealer, Ed Thorpe. I mean, here you are, a guy who was chief risk manager at AQR, a $100 billion plus fund. And here you are giving insights to my audience, to everyone that's going to listen. And you're essentially saying, you know what? It was that 21 book from a guy named Ed Thorpe back 50s, 60s. And that was my driver. That was my influence. And I would love you to expand on that and kind of really give your big picture view. But also, at first, before you even go there, the 8 or 9 year old Aaron, what was the takeaway at 8 or 9? Because I have a feeling you might remember what it was. I mean, there must have been some big aha moment within that text. Was it just learning the rules of the game properly? Was there something that he said that this drove you from that moment in time?
There used to be something called newspapers that, many younger people don't remember, but that's how we used to get our news before the internet. And the newspaper would come every day. And this is actually true of a lot of kids of my age. I read it backwards. I read it from the back because in the back were all the numbers. And there were stock quotations, there were baseball box scores, there were all kinds of numbers. And those made sense to me. As I got further and further up into the paper where it started getting more words and news and this and that, it just seemed irrelevant and impossible to understand. And one of the reasons, by the way, I think I was right, is if I gave you a newspaper from 50 years ago, the headlines would make no sense. You have zero interest in any of the things. People were, the bond issue for the bridge, the attack here, the disaster there. None of that would seem to matter at all. But people still track those baseball statistics and still track those stock market prices. So I was right that was the really important stuff. And I'm noticing patterns in it. I'm noticing I can, do some math on the things and I can predict some things. And it didn't take me long to start thinking, well, gee, you could, make some money. But I didn't really believe you could do it. I thought, okay, I'm noticing patterns, but, they can't possibly be right. It can't be that easy to predict horse races or to predict stock price movements and so on. Then I'd go to the library and I'd look for books. Our library didn't have, public library didn't have a great selection of gambling books, but, every so often there'd be, and would stick in. And most of them were written by people who did not seem very smart. Most of them were, some of the ideas were just wrong. Other ideas probably made some sense from kind of experience, but weren't based on any logic or reasoning. And then I come across this book by a math professor, and he explains exactly why it works. And he explained that he actually went there and did it and made it work. And the whole animating motivation of the book, how he talked about, I got interested in this problem and I worked on the problem and I solved the problem. And then I went out and I bet and I won. That resonated very strongly with me. That is what I wanted to do with life. I wanted to find problems, solve them, not just make some money. Making money is one way to prove your solution works, but the key is you're beating somebody. You're doing what you're not supposed to do. Everybody tells you can't beat the house, you can't fight City Hall, you can't do anything, you can't beat the market. And here's a guy who says, yeah, you can, and he used some math. And I understood the math, and I could do the math myself. I couldn't actually reproduce his computations at the time because I didn't have as big a computer as he did, but I could work out approximations that were enough to convince me that the thing actually worked. Even mathematicians at the time, this is something that really hit me. There were mathematicians at the time who dismissed the work, not because they had gone through the math and decided it was wrong, but they had this idea, you can't beat the house. No system of betting can ever win. And they had, for so many centuries, mathematicians have told people, no, a martingale strategy doesn't work at roulette. No, betting on the number that hasn't come up, in the last 20 spins doesn't work. They've gotten so ingrained that they forgot the mathematical basis for the reason the casino wins and started taking it as just a religious article. And the fact that, even mathematicians would do that, much less everybody else, told me I was on to a rare and secret truth.
It sounds like also just as a really big kind of aha moment that when you saw, even though it was via your library through a book, the moment you saw that someone else could do it, they proved it. You didn't know him at all. Obviously, you had no connection to him. Maybe you've met him by now, you're later on in life, but you had no connection. So a distant, immediate lightning bolt inspiration. Okay, if he can do it, I can do it.
Yep. And by the way, yes, I have met him since, and he's a friend. Doesn't live too far from here, actually. But yes, I didn't know him. But it was very important that he was a math professor. It was very important he was from MIT. If just, some random guy had done this, if I had come across, one of the books by some of the later blackjack experts, Arnold Snyder or someone who didn't have the academic credential, then I would not have been so convinced. But my father was a professor. I was used to the idea that, a PhD from MIT means something. And if he says it and I can kind of follow his reasoning and verify it, I believe it. If somebody had written a book, how I made $1 million playing blackjack, and here's my system, I would not have meant the same thing to me.
I want to take a slight divergence from where we are right now to go to something, a side topic to this world. I see many, many traders, and I first noticed this over 15 years ago. I kept seeing so many traders, so many people on Wall Street had this love affair for Ayn Rand. And I've noticed on Quora.com, you are the champion in terms of answers, and really so much of it seems to be even beyond Wall Street. And so many people are really coming to you for views on liberty. They really want, the Aaron Brown view on liberty. Why don't you also give me a starting place for that too? when you first had your kind of, I don't want to say come to Jesus, but your first moment where you wrapped your arms around the idea of Smith and Hume and Hayek and Mises and Rand, and you said to yourself, okay, this is really resonating with me?
I didn't read Ayn Rand until much later in life. I'm not particularly, whatever I say, I'm not particularly impressed by most of it. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. Came to that stuff much later. My kind of native self-invented libertarianism comes from just an idea that institutions are big and stupid, and I just always wanted to beat casinos. I wanted to beat the government. I wanted to beat the market. I wanted that kind of individualism, and that the enemy of all of that was always stupid people who organized together to keep you down, to suppress innovation, to make sure that they were comfortable regardless of what happened to anybody else. It was by no means a philosophical or political libertarianism. It was just a personal desire to do what I wanted and to do it on my own. Older, I was probably in college when I came across reading some of these people, and some of it resonated with me, some of it didn't. Eventually, I guess I consider myself sort of a Hayek, would be the closest thinker. A lot of libertarians, sort of the Ayn Randian libertarians, can be pretty weird. Murray Rothbard type hard property rights libertarians, they say a lot of stuff I don't agree with. There's a certain kind of libertarian who believes you should have absolutely no government, except you should have this extraordinarily powerful, vicious, violent thing to protect property rights. And that just made zero sense to me. If I don't regard property rights as any more important than any other. In fact, they're probably less important than most other rights. Within the libertarians of like the 70s and 80s, 90s, I was kind of a touchy-feely, a pacifist type. I was a moral libertarian. I start everything from it's never right to initiate violence against an innocent, and that when you reason from that, you just rule out almost all the things governments do. But I never really started out with rights of man or objectivism or anything like that. I think libertarians have kind of moved toward me. I think I'm now more mainstream than I would have been in those days. So the main actual thing I ever did, I was never an organizer. I never did anything. I would refuse to give my Social Security number. And I did that for many years. It got harder and harder. Eventually I gave it up probably sometime around the mid-'80s or so. It just got too hard to do it. But, you learn a lot about libertarianism if you actually try and do that, just you tell people, no, I don't have to give you my Social Security number. The law says I don't have to give it to you. I can carry a piece of the law around with me to show it to you. Life got very, very difficult. I sort of feel bad that I gave that up. I wish I was still doing that. Of course, in 1976, they changed the law, and now you are basically required to give your Social Security number. That was the kind of thing that appealed to me.
Do you ever think, like in modern times right now, 2018, do you sometimes think the fight for liberty, and you mentioned various incarnations and I mentioned some names, you mentioned some names. Do you ever think that fight is lost for America?
No, I absolutely don't. The fight was, in the 70s and 80s, it was basically people who had escaped communism. And they had some very specific ideas that didn't really apply, and they did lose. And I think, they're gone. They're historical relics. They're not going to be, and a lot of libertarian organizations still, worship them and still, have their writings, but they're just not really relevant. I think that by changes in technology, people are reclaiming a lot of liberty. I don't think there's going to be a huge change of governments, giving people liberty in areas where they had previously not had it. There'll be a little of that, things like gay marriage, abortion rights, legalization of marijuana, and so on. That's not going to go all that far. But people are going to invent ways to be free. I don't think there is a political will to stop that. And even if they had the will, their ability is questionable. It's very hard for government to deal with innovation. So I think a generation will grow up that is used to the fact that you can do what you want without too much oversight and regulation. I don't think we're going to go to a pure libertarian society, but I do think my children will be much freer than I was.
I have so many economists come on this show, and we share insights about these topics. So I was just really curious your opinion. I appreciate that. I want to shift into something that really starts to get into when people are listening, they say, hey, I really want to know something about this from Aaron. If I want to take you back in time, gosh, I can't believe it's a decade now, right? To 07, 08, right? Can you really, it just seems time has flown from that time period. When you look back on that time period, a decade ago, and I'm sure you've reassessed every month, every year since then and kind of thought about that time period. What is the big takeaway now, a decade later, for you? I mean, like if you're just kind of talking to yourself and you're sharing views on risk management, what is your takeaway for that time period?
I think the most important thing about it from my point of view is it was actually the most statistically predictable, by the book financial crisis we've ever had. It's the antithesis of 1987. 1987 was the weirdest, the one that violated all the rules we thought we knew. Most financial crises, they follow certain patterns. And to somebody who's, 20,000 feet away, somebody who's looking, they all look the same. Well, people got greedy and over leveraged, and then it fell apart, and then there was a crisis. But when you actually live through these things and you're responsible for lots of money and you're having to make decisions of what to do, you get a very different view. There's a very different feel for different kinds of crises. This one was very predictable. I mean, I don't mean I could predict it. Hold on, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it was very much of a random walk crisis. If you look, you saw volatility going up, and then you saw up and down movements that you would expect given that volatility, and you saw a big down move, and then you saw a big up move. The only thing about it that was kind of unpredictable, out of left field, that surprised a lot of people, including me, and caused problems, was the government reaction. The government did not react the way I would have expected on it, and that messed things up a lot. The other thing I say about it is people have a tendency, it's so Nassim Taleb's narrative fallacy. They tend to tell a story about something, and they tend to tell a story in the order things happened. And, the first thing that the first shoe that dropped in this crisis was subprime. And so people call it the subprime crisis, and they kind of trace it. Well, there were subprimes, and that led to CDOs, and CDOs led to CDO squared, and blah, blah, blah. But when you look back, and you actually see, okay, what was really going on? What was the problem? It certainly wasn't subprime. It just wasn't big enough. We had 5 previous subprime crises, and none of them even made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They were just, contained within the subprime field. The fact that, these subprime pools, you expected a 5% loss rate, and you got about a 20% loss rate. Well, that's bad news. You're sorry you bought it, but you expected a 5% loss rate. You built in a 10% extra, interest kicker so that you would make money even with a 5% loss rate. So you expected to make 5% on these things, actually end up losing 10%. That's just not a disastrous occurrence. That's not something that makes institutions fail. That's not a gigantic surprise. Prime mortgages, there was a much bigger surprise. There were pools that should have had a 0.03% default rate that actually had a 1 or 2% default rate. That's a much, much bigger surprise. But even that wasn't enough. I think what you really have to think about, you have to say, let's look at 2007 to 2012. Let's look at the 5-year period. And the really, really big event in there, the sovereign debt crisis that kind of hit starting in 2010 with Greece and kind of spread. And people figured out that governments do not have enough money to pay the promises that they had made. And we kind of already knew that. But it was always actuarial. People were always saying, okay, in 25 years, the Social Security trust fund runs out, or you project things out. But when you project things out, people say, well, if investment returns are a little better, if healthcare costs don't rise so fast, if demographic projections come in a little better, the whole thing might go away. So let's worry about it tomorrow. When you actually have things start failing, when Greece actually fails, when Iceland actually fails, when Ireland actually fails, when Spain and Italy nearly fail, where Portugal nearly fail, that's a problem today. You have to deal with it today. And I think that change in mindset was the ultimate cause of what happened. The reason it showed up was Okay, so subprime has problems. So hedge funds have problems. The Bear Stearns hedge funds have problems. The Bear Stearns hedge fund problems spread to Bear Stearns. The Bear Stearns problems spread to the U.S. government. That's when people started doing the math and saying, wait a minute, the governments can't bail out the banks. If the banks lose money, that is not a statistically unpredictable amount of money. It's not something that somebody should have said was impossible. It was something that you would have expected if you were just looking at the value at risk these banks were publishing, if you were looking at the volatility of their stock prices and so on. In a bad event, but not a 10 standard deviation event, a 2.5 standard deviation bad event for the banks, the governments are helpless. And if the governments are helpless, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen to the value of our money. That was the reason, by the way, that Bitcoin was invented. At the time, nobody was paying any attention to that. But in fact, that was, here was a guy in 2008 who was seeing forward, or a group, we don't really know which, and seeing forward saying the real ultimate issue here is government credit, is the value of money. That was not resolved until about 2012. That's when it went away. So the stock market, drops 50%, goes back up 100%, goes back up another 100%, and all that's where all the attention is focused. Banks go out of business, new government entities are formed, new laws are passed. That's all the attention. But the real issue was people believe that governments, and I'm talking primarily about here, developed country governments, have surmounted the short-term problem of everything falling apart. We're not going to run out of money in the next 5 or 10 years. We're back to that actuarial problem 25 years down the road, where there's a lot of ways you can hope that things will get better. And to me, that was the nature of the crisis. Sovereign credit was the key, which we didn't know, nobody had any idea about until 2010 or so.
Would you say that everything that took place, the various players, whether it was the feds or Mr. Buffett stepping up and getting some sweetheart deals, et cetera, TARP, lowering interest rates to zero, all these actions in hindsight from your perspective, would you say these were all correct and it all worked?
Well, it worked in the sense that everything survived, but I think things would have survived pretty much the same without those actions. I don't think those were so important. I think people are very conservative about finance. There's this real superstition that finance is all about confidence, and if somehow the public loses confidence, the whole system breaks down. Finance is not about confidence. Finance is about real solid economic relationships. There's really solid mathematics. You can trace this on. It's not about people panicking or doing stupid things. And therefore, all of the focus on we have to prevent panic, we have to prevent a bank run, we have to reassure the market. All that's nonsense. What really people did the math and found out that the government did have the money. It didn't really matter whether that money was in the Fed or whether the Fed used the money to buy assets from the bank. People figured out, the United States government has enough credit to keep the banks solvent and to keep the financial system running and to keep the dollar having value and to keep promises about pensions and health care and so forth. And that's when the stock market went back up. And then in Europe, it took a little longer because it was a lot closer call in Europe. And of course, in Greece, it couldn't be done. But people were willing. People decided, okay, Greece and Cyprus and a few other places are the outliers. The basic France, Germany can keep their promises, at least for long enough that somebody can maybe figure out a solution.
Okay, so that brings us up back to today. And I want to toss out a phrase that everyone hears and near and dear to you, the efficient market hypothesis, right? And so you have attended the University of Chicago and for your MBA, So we have on one side of the equation, in my mind, I can see Eugene Fama on one side of the equation. The other side, I can see people like Benoit Mandelbrot. I can see Jean-Philippe Bouchot out of Paris. I can see David Harding of Winton Capital. I can see this kind of dividing line between these camps, right? And you've kind of painted a picture of being a pretty pragmatic guy. Can you fill in the blanks for me? Is it really two poles? There's a chasm there, there's a separation, and it's two camps that just see the world very differently? Or is it been positioned as being more different than it really is?
People certainly feel very differently about it, and people will give you very different. Like Eugene Fama, still absolutely in his heart. You sit down with him, really believes everything is efficient, even though he's published, the 5 Fama French factors, even though he's admitted there's, multiple risk factors and that things aren't completely efficient. He doesn't really accept it. And in fact, he will frequently forget it. You'll talk to him about things and you'll have to remind him, wait a minute, gee, you published a paper that said that wasn't the case. He really believes, I think, that someone in the future will come up with a more sophisticated understanding of risk adjustments and we will restore efficiency. I never took that idea too seriously. I mean, to me, efficient markets certainly doesn't mean the market is always wise or good. It doesn't even mean the market is always right. It just means the market's right on average. So it's pretty hard to beat it. It's, right on average doesn't sound that great, but it's a lot better than people manage to do. But you can, with very careful mathematics, eke out a small edge, a lot like at Thorpe and casinos. Casinos are still making huge amounts of money. They're still building big buildings. They're still making gigantic profits, even though Ed Thorpe figured out, no, there's a way to beat them. Markets are the same way, that for 99% of people, 99% of the time, should assume the market is efficient, should pay the lowest possible fees, should, get a diversified, low-cost, tax-efficient portfolio and forget about trying to beat it. But if you're a quant and if you live to beat things, there's lots and lots of ways to beat it.
I've seen you talk about this when people want to frame the notion of risk. They kind of put the emotional words on it. It's either negative or positive. From your quant perspective, you don't approach it that way at all, do you?
No, risk should be a neutral thing, and the example I like to give, in a sports contest, if you're ahead, you want to minimize volatility. You want to play slow. You want to, do things that will probably result in nobody scoring. If you're behind, you do wild things. You might pull the goalie in hockey. You might, do just reckless attacks in football. And it's just something you adjust up and down to achieve a goal. It's not right or wrong. It's not good or bad. It doesn't, you don't judge it by its result. You just choose what is the appropriate level for what you want to do. And here's where, John Kelly comes in. John Kelly is the guy who figured this out. And Ed Thorpe was the guy who popularized Kelly's views.
As we stay in this risk conversation, you've brought up Nassim Taleb. We've talked about the financial crisis. I can think of Don Rumsfeld and his unknown unknowns speech. Why don't you give me your perspective on black swans, right? So I think ever since his book came out with the same title, since the crisis, most large institutions, operations, at least they obviously have a knowledge of this now. Now, whether or not they're taking preparations for it or not, that's a whole different issue. How do you perceive preparation for a black swan? And do people go far enough or too far?
Nassim has given actually different definitions of a black swan. The one I like best is a black swan is a low probability, high impact event that happened because it was unexpected. If you take that attitude, go back to 9/11, we knew there were hijackers. There have been lots and lots of hijackers of airplanes, but all of the previous ones had wanted to live. And we knew there were suicide bombers, but all of them had been low-skill young men, usually men anyway, who struck close to home. Therefore, we had all the security around both of those things. We had zero security against a high-skill, coordinated group of hijackers who didn't want to live, who were willing to die, and therefore that's why the attacks happened. And if we had, let's say we had prepared against it, we thought, that might happen, and we took precautions. We locked cockpit doors. We, did all the other things we do now. The terrorists would have found some other way to create an event, Preparing for a black swan, you can change the nature of the black swan, but you're not going to avoid it. Things are still going to happen because they're unexpected, and there's just no way around that. So trying to prepare for that is counterproductive. All you do is you make yourself more predictable. You're better off not doing that. In terms of the sort of more everyday black swan, the one that happens is just always out there, just low probability, high impact, that people do know about, I think people don't give enough attention to that. One of the things Nassim said that I really agree with is people overestimate the probability of the last big event recurring, and they underestimate the probability of some new type of event occurring. Another part of his philosophy that I think people forget is, yes, he's famous for buying out of the money options, but he's also famous for buying at the money options. His general philosophy is that people expect the average amount of change, and that almost never happens. Either nothing happens or something much bigger than average happens. But people do all their planning as if, we're going to get a 1 standard deviation event. It's a very good bet. It's a big money-making event to say, look, we're either going to get something, within 0.1 standard deviation, or we're going to get something beyond 2 standard deviations. Things are just a lot more concentrated in the center and in the tails. A lot of the money you make, a lot of the actual financial advantage, a lot of the quant advantage consists of betting nothing will happen. I think regulators, I think people who don't have a lot of experience in actually managing risk, who just, sort of try and do it by gut, tend to be preparing for those 1 standard deviation events, the ones that don't happen.
Aaron, I can't keep you. I could probably just sit here and pick your mind across all kinds of topics, just like they do on Quora all day long. Let me direct people. All your books, Amazon, easily found. Is there a website we can send people to? Any place you want them to come check out more about you? I guess they can just go to Quora and ask questions, yeah?
They can. I also have a website, eRaider, ERAIDER.com. I'm not real diligent about keeping it up to date, but it's got some fun stuff there if people want to know me. And it's got an email address, or they can, get me through Quora or lots of other places. Bloomberg, if you look at my Bloomberg articles, they've got my email address at the bottom.
Aaron, cool stuff. I appreciate you taking some time today. And enjoy Coronado. The sunsets are the best, right? Point Loma off to the right, the best stuff, huh?
It is, although I have to say that this time of year, we don't get the greatest views. When they're, a little later in the summer, we'll get them actually over the ocean. But right now they're behind the point, but it's still beautiful.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Take care. My guest today is Jeffrey Myron. He is an American economist. He once served as the chairman of the Department of Economics at Boston University, currently teaches economics at Harvard. He also currently holds the position of Director of Economic Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And for those of you that have a pulse, that know something about economics, you already know that Jeffrey probably has a very strong libertarian bent. Well, if you thought that, you guessed right, because he does. One little disclaimer on this episode. Unfortunately, the technical snafu happened and I lost about 20 minutes of our conversation. But doing my level-headed best, I stitched together a couple of Jeffrey's presentations from other sources, and as it turns out, it became one very interesting episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jeffrey Myron. I know you are intimately involved with Cato, the Institute. Something kind of interesting to me about Cato, I've read some papers and stuff over the years. There was a great paper that someone did out of Cato about long-term capital management. But there's also a paper that's really interesting about drug policy toward a moral drug policy written by a trader named Richard Dennis. He's not on the Cato board anymore, but he had to have been on the board for over 20 years, which is really interesting because he was a feature of my second book. One of your current board members, Rebecca Dunn, is the wife of Bill Dunn, who was profiled in my first book. And I really have to commend my first meetings with Bill Dunn in the mid-1990s. Before I knew anything about his views on liberty, the handshake of the man at the time set me in motion, I think. I mean, it was almost like I didn't know anything about his views on liberty, but meeting him and seeing how he did things was such an influence. And then I've really kind of an interesting trader connection for me to Cato. I don't know if you're aware of any of the names and all that connection yourself.
I know all those names. I don't know those people especially well. I've met them a few times at Cato events. I certainly have noticed that a number of our contributors have backgrounds in finance or trading because it sort of makes sense. People who've done that have accumulated some wealth and therefore are in a position to make donations. I suspect there's some common thread that if you're in the trading industry, if you're in the finance industry, which is sort of based on merit, people are keeping score, there's not much push to think about the equity or the fairness of it. It's just who the smartest trader wins. That probably has a little bit of overlap with the libertarian perspective on the world.
Can I tell you what's really interesting, too, over the last 20 years observing the traders? The other overlap, Ayn Rand. It's like Ayn Rand is in the blood system of trading. It's like I'm right there, too. You know, I'm a big fan. I mean, I love going back and watching her old Mike Wallace interview from decades ago. I think that's fabulous. Going back in time, explain to my audience what got you going down the liberty path in particular. And when did that first hit you? As a young guy? I mean, was there a moment, something where it just struck you? You're like, liberty, damn it, this is where I'm at.
I'll answer that in a couple parts. First, I came to it more as an economics person, not a liberty person. Economics gives a lot of reasons why we should be skeptical about government intervention. Not because economics teaches us that markets do everything perfectly, but it does suggest that markets do things reasonably well in many circumstances, most circumstances. And more importantly, I would say, economics teaches that there are huge unintended consequences of trying to fix the market or fix other private institutions. It's not that the market is perfect and the interventions are terrible. Markets are imperfect, but the interventions are even worse, and so the right choice is still, generally speaking, the market or the private arrangements. Now, in terms of a moment, I had started working on the drug legalization issue kind of by dumb luck back in the late 80s, early 1990s, and had published a paper making the case for legalizing drugs in one of the standard economics journals. And a friend I was chatting with said, I read your piece and I agree with it. I really enjoyed it, but I just hope you're not one of those nuts who thinks that guns should also be legal. And I actually hadn't given it much thought at that point. I was not a libertarian at that point. This was when I was well into my career. I grew up in a very liberal, not classically liberal, modern liberal leaning household. I stopped and thought for a second and said to him, well, you know, all the reasons for keeping drugs legal would apply more or less similarly to keeping guns legal. All the unintended negative consequences of outlawing any market are going to be the same, so why wouldn't I also want to keep guns legal? Then I just sort of kept thinking more from there and decided I wanted to evaluate the sort of conservative positions a little bit more carefully and think about which ones I disagreed with and which ones I actually had some sympathy for. And then the other moment was I did a visit at Harvard from where I was teaching at the time at Boston University, and they said, you can teach a course about anything you want. I decided to teach about libertarianism, and I went through all the standard policy issues and tried to make the best case I could make for the small government or no government approach, and ended up realizing I was sort of convinced that I really was a pro-liberty small government person sort of across the board, whether it was social issues or economic issues or foreign policy issues.
I'm curious, in 1986, where were you living? Do you remember?
1986, I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Michigan, okay.
As an assistant professor at the University of Michigan.
I knew you were pretty close to, at that point in time, being in the Boston area. And so, you know, in 1986, I was a senior in high school. I was living in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. I watched all of my friends in high school, Catholic high school, try cocaine for the first time. I said to myself, and this was after Lynn Bias, who was living 30 miles away in College Park, Maryland, after he had just doused himself. I was a huge Celtics fan at the time. They had just won the world championship. They happened to have the high pick. They take Bias, the closest thing to Michael Jordan. It was an eye-opener for me. And I said, you know, I'm not going to choose that path. But you know what? At that point in time, I wasn't like going to put a bag over my friends' heads and say, hey, man, you really shouldn't be doing coke. You know, Bias just died. But it was like, why should this get beyond the personal choice at that moment? A simple example, very noteworthy for people that recall Lynn Bias. But like, okay, I saw Lynn Bias die. I'm not going to do coke. My friends saw Lynn Bias die. They're doing coke. But why should the government be in the middle of all those transactions? If Lynn Bias died doing coke, I mean, you can't stop the guy from doing coke. He did the damn coke and died.
I mean, I obviously agree with you. The government shouldn't be involved in people's decisions about using drugs, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, any of the standard vices, victimless crimes, and so on. people can point to the fact, who advocate prohibition can point to the fact that some people suffer bad outcomes from using Coke, like Len Bias. Of course, some people die in automobiles every day, and we don't think that's a reason to outlaw automobiles. It might be a reason to want to have seat belts. It might be a reason to have speed limits, but it's certainly not a reason to outlaw automobiles. Now, how do you reconcile those two different things? I think many people just won't accept the notion that if I happen to want to be intoxicated or under the influence of whatever substance, that that's perfectly okay, that that's not any better or worse than if someone wants to go watch a movie or listen to an opera or read a book or any other private choice. There's this puritanical streak that says being intoxicated is wrong, that it's not a good or an acceptable way to derive enjoyment. I don't share that view. I think that policy should be neutral about how people choose to spend their time, spend their money, and what things they want to put in their bodies.
So when you're behind the scenes, because you get a chance to rub elbows in your various minglings around with people that probably have these puritanical leanings, when you're behind closed doors, do they drop their guard down and say, you know, Jeffrey, and we're going to dive into some of the specifics of how you break down the various aspects of drug prohibition. But behind closed doors, to some of the puritanical types, do they drop the guard down and say, of course, Jeffrey, you're right, this is crazy, but, you know, we've got constituencies and we've got groups that want this and want that, so we've just got to be illogical. What do they say behind closed doors to you? Because you've got the winning argument. I mean, I don't know how it's debatable.
I think there's a range of things. I think it's a good illustration of this theme that runs through lots of libertarian commentary on policy that's known as the bootleggers and Baptists theme. A lot of people don't necessarily want to say that they're opposed to people making their own decisions. They kind of are willing to accept that, except they also believe, without being very critical, the claims that people have trouble making rational decisions on their own and that these substances are necessarily or typically very harmful. So then they're kind of hiding behind this allegedly benevolent paternalism. They're trying to do the right thing by helping people rather than interfering with people's liberty or free choice to engage in these activities, by relying on the idea that people are making mistakes and that therefore government can come in and help people protect them from themselves. Now, it relates to the bootleggers part because, of course, there also are people who are taking these positions for reasons that are pure self-interest, that are not based on any, in my view, misguided, but nevertheless meant to be benevolent paternalism. These are people who are in criminal justice. These are people who are in the treatment sector. These are politicians who find it advantageous to rant against drugs as an evil because it helps them get elected. There are many, many cases where there's both a Baptist justification, a we're helping people in some way, but also a bootlegger aspect. This is really just somebody's naked self-interest, special interest that's supporting this interventionist policy. And then the bootleggers get to hide behind the Baptist, the do-good veneer, and lots of those policies end up being successful in the political marketplace, even though you and I agree they're doing lots of harm.
We don't have them here on the conversation, but give those hypothetical Baptists right now that are listening, give them some data, connect some money spent and connect some crime statistics, homicide rates, etc. Connect that storyline there, because I know you know these numbers like the back of your hand. Give people a feeling for the do-gooders out there. So, okay, we're going down this path, we're spending all this money, and here's the results.
We are spending, as a country overall, state, federal, local, something like $50 to $60 billion a year on criminal justice activities, police, prosecutors, prison guards, et cetera, in order to the attempts to enforce the drug laws. Of course, we're not enforcing it very effectively. There still are significant drug markets, and most people who want to consume these substances are able to consume the substances, albeit at somewhat elevated prices. We're also foregoing a similar order of magnitude, something like $50 billion a year in tax revenues that all levels of government together could collect if we legalized drugs and treated them similarly to other legal goods, or perhaps similarly to alcohol and tobacco, where they face somewhat higher tax rates, but nevertheless relatively modest tax rates, so that we don't drive the market underground. $100 billion a year difference in the overall U.S. budget deficit. That's turned out not by itself going to solve the fact that we have this long-term fiscal imbalance, but it's still a step in the right direction. And we would get that while getting all the other benefits of legalization, reduce crime, corruption, interference with people's ability to use these substances medicinally, and so on.
Yes, unfortunately, this is about the point in time where the pixelization of our conversation became too much. As an extra, this presentation from Jeffrey talks about trade-offs, a great reminder for a world that wants to scream about this and be emotional about that. Listen to what a very grounded voice has to say about economic trade-offs.
Economics does two different kinds of analyses. We do ones that are referred to as positive, okay, which means that they're descriptive, they're predictive. They just try to say, what do we expect to happen in certain situations? Okay? Like science tries to predict what happens if you hold a ball at shoulder height and you let go. It says there's this thing we can't see or measure called gravity, and it pulls it down to the floor. Okay? The second type of economic analysis is known as normative, and it makes a judgment about which policies are best. Okay? So the term positive, of course, is incredibly annoying, one of many ways in which economists use everyday words to mean something completely different. It doesn't mean it's a good analysis or that it's saying anything and it is good. It's saying we're just trying to understand the science of exactly how things work. The normative analysis, okay, makes a judgment. Okay? And as you'll see, we need to make additional assumptions, okay, in order to get from the positive to the normative. So the two are related, in particular, positive analysis, figuring out what will happen if government does policy X versus policy Y, okay, clearly may inform your views over whether policy X is better than policy Y, okay, but it's not the same thing, and you have to say something additional to conclude that one policy is better than another. So positive economics is trying to be scientific. We have models of how people or firms or governments behave. We test these models with data. Okay? So in principle, okay, economics is like physics. Okay? Now, my son, who wants to be a physicist, just laughs uproariously when I say that. Of course, economics is way less precise than physics is. Why? Mainly because economists can't do experiments. We don't have a parallel universe in which Ben Bernanke did not become Fed chair or the government did not conduct the TARP bailouts, and we get to observe what happened in that otherwise identical, okay, version of the United States or the world. We can't do that for most interesting economics questions, okay? But in principle, okay, we're trying to do things like physics. We posit a set of models, and then we test those models with data, and that part is designed to be and should be value-free. Two different decently trained economists should agree on any positive analysis, subject to normal, scientific uncertainty. There's some things we don't know about, and so, of course, there might be some room for disagreement. So the standard supply and demand model that most of you have heard of, okay, is a standard positive economic model. It tells us what's going to happen if more people want to buy a particular good relative to the previous period. That's going to shift the demand curve out, raise the price, increase the quantity sold. There's no value there. There's no judgment. There's nothing necessarily good or bad. It's just a model that predicts what will happen under certain exogenous changes. Now, any analysis, okay, has to think about two things. Okay? It has to think about the constraints that are faced by the people in those settings, in those models, in those examples, and it has to think about how people make choices. And these are two completely separate and really important things that interact. Okay? Lots of the criticism you hear about economists and economics focuses on the second component. People allege that we as economists assume that everybody's hyper-rational, that everybody has all the necessary information, that they only care about their utility or their wealth or whatever. Okay? That's really, first of all, not right, but second of all, it's missing a crucial part of what makes economics, which is the first component, the fact that people face constraints. Their choices are not unconstrained, whatever their objective function is, okay, for those choices. Okay? So I'm going to go through those two pieces, okay, in succession. So if you had to define economics in one line, economics is just the observation that resources are scarce or resources are finite. There's only so much stuff. At any moment in time, the rate at which we can produce new stuff over time is finite. We can't just assert that we should double GDP between this year and next year. There are limits. There are things that constrain the amount of resources we have. And this, to the extent economics is a science, this is part of it. This is a fact. This does not have anything to do with whether people are rational or not, whether they have psychological influence or not. This is just something that we have to accept. Okay? Accounting identities are identities. They always hold. Constraints are constraints. So one way to describe economics says we believe the laws of arithmetic. Okay? We believe that 2 + 2 is 4. It's never 5 or 7 or 86. And you'll be amazed at how often you listen to statements by politicians and other advocates of policy that want you to believe that they can make 2 plus 2 be something other than 4. We'll see lots of examples in a few minutes. So let's look at examples of the standard constraints. We think that consumers are constrained by their budgets, firms are constrained by the technology they have available to make stuff and by the market, and governments are constrained in particular by something I'll explain in more detail in a minute called the present value budget constraint. So, constraints for consumers. Think about a really, really simple case first. You have a consumer who has a given amount of income at a moment in time. You can imagine, say, someone with $50 in the wallet. They walk into a grocery store. This is pre-ATMs, pre-credit cards, debit cards, all that stuff. So that day, as you walk in that grocery store, there's only so much you can purchase. Whatever your choices are, say there are 2 goods, X and Y, and each has a price, piece of X or piece of Y. The total amount you spend has to be less than or equal to the amount of money you brought with you when you went into the store. And that's true whether your choices are rational or not. It's true whether you happen to like ice cream or you happen to like steak or you happen to like vegetables. Your choices have to satisfy the constraint. Okay? So there are bounds on what a consumer might do regardless of how we think that consumer is likely to behave. Now, if we had a dynamic setting, slightly more realistically, people don't just live at an instant in time. They earn income, they save, they accumulate, work, and so on. They might be able to borrow in many settings. It's still true that there's a constraint. It's just slightly more complicated. We know that their lifetime consumption cannot exceed their lifetime income, plus whatever gifts they might have gotten from friends or parents, plus any inheritance, and plus any borrowing. But the amount of resources your parents might give you is finite. The amount that the bank is willing to lend to you is finite. So still, even when we look in this intertemporal way, each consumer faces a constraint that puts bounds on the consumer's choices. Okay? Might seem sort of obvious, okay, but it's really, really, really important. Here's an example of why it's really important. When we talk about whether tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy, okay, people say, oh, consumers will have more disposable income if we cut taxes, so they'll go out and spend more. Okay, but if those consumers have any brains, okay, they should think to themselves, you know what, the government's not going to have resources, okay, forever to keep making tax cuts. At some point in the future, it's going to raise taxes to pay back the borrowing it did just now. That means that my taxes are going to go up in the future by roughly the amount that they were cut just now. Therefore, my lifetime resources hasn't really changed. Okay? So I actually can't afford to spend anything more than I could before my taxes were cut, okay, because I know that over my lifetime, that's all going to average out. Okay, we'll see that again, okay, in another minute. Okay, if you think about that, that then says government's attempt to stimulate the economy with tax cuts may be much less effective than it's assumed to be in the Keynesian model. Well, why? The Keynesian model just says people are only thinking about today, they completely ignore the future in making their choices. That's not realistic and raises this huge issue. Firms, of course, face constraints. What do I mean by firms? Any organization, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever, that takes inputs, okay, and makes outputs. Okay? So firms obviously face technological constraints. Okay? They can only get a given quantity of inputs of output from the inputs that they have. Okay? And so they can't just respond to everything as they would like. Okay? If you've read the biography of Steve Jobs, you see really cool illustrations of this. He would be yelling and screaming at his engineers, no, the iPhone has to have these characteristics. It has to have this much battery life and this kind of screen. And they'd say, no, it won't all fit in there. You can't do that. Now, of course, Steve Jobs was famous for pushing them really hard and sometimes making them work hard enough that they did figure out a way. So the production, they shifted the production function over time, but with great effort and resources. Okay? So firms have to take technologies as given. Sort of even more important, or maybe less sort of obviously, firms have to accept the market. The demand for any firm's commodities are downward sloping, meaning the higher the price the firm charges, the less it will be able to sell. Okay? So firms might have some ability to nudge that relation. If you advertise or market your product well, maybe you can sell a little bit more for a given demand curve. But that takes resources and has limits. So firms can't just assume that they can sell whatever they want, okay, at any price they want, okay, because the market imposes this relation, the downward sloping demand curve. Let's look at an extreme case of that because it's useful and comes up. And this specific example comes up in lots of cases. People complain about monopolies. They say monopolies are evil. Why? Because they can charge whatever they want. Okay, well, that's just nonsense if you think it all in terms of constraints. Okay, why? Because if they could charge whatever they wanted, the price of an iPhone would already be $8 million a phone or $8 billion a phone. They obviously can't charge whatever they want. Their ability to set a higher price is constrained by the market demand curve. If Apple sets a higher price, they're going to sell fewer iPhones. Okay, so there's a trade-off. Even a monopolist knows it will lose sales, okay, when it raises price, and it's going to choose some balance between higher price per unit and the number of units it sells, okay, in setting its policy. Okay. Finally, constraints for government. Okay, this one is crucial. I sort of alluded to it a little bit already. Governments obviously raise revenue by taxing or borrowing. Lots of people think that government expenditure can do all sorts of beneficial things: hire the unemployed during recessions, give free health care to everyone, provide public schools, and on and on and on. Billions of examples. So if the government can always just tax more or borrow more, okay, and these things are good that it might do with that revenue, why doesn't it do all of that and more for everyone all the time? Because the taxing power is finite. The particular relation is referred to by economists as the present value budget constraint. That just means the sum of all the taxes the government raises, okay, sum of all of its expenditure can't be more than the sum of all taxes it collects. People aren't going to keep lending to a government forever, okay, if it is trying to spend way more than its economy could ever justify. We've seen this in dramatic fashion in Greece and Portugal and Italy and Spain over the last several years. Those countries had paths for their expenditure that they could never pay for because their economies weren't large enough or growing fast enough to generate nearly enough tax revenue. People started to recognize it, so what did they do? They stopped lending to those countries, or only lending at extremely high interest rates, which made the situations even worse. Okay? And so government's power was finite. Okay, many of you have heard of the Laffer curve. That's one way of embodying the fact that the government faces constraints. As it raises tax rates and tries to take more and more, it's going to induce more avoidance and evasion. At some point, when the tax rate gets to be 100%, it collects zero revenue, okay, because no one's going to ever bother to earn any income, or certainly not report that income to the government, if 100% of it is going to be taken away. Okay? And as I mentioned, you might think, oh, the government, some people would like to argue the government can get around this by borrowing, but the borrowing has to be repaid, and the market will impose the constraint if you try to borrow more than your economy is ever able to generate. So this is relevant to talking about stimulus policies, to bailouts, to austerity programs. All of those have to face the reality that there's only so much stuff. All the things that the European governments have been doing to bail out Greece, they're not creating more wealth. They're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Why? Because that's what the budget constraint says. More for Peter, okay, or more for Greece and less for Germany, okay, doesn't change the overall total. Recognizing that there are these constraints already gives you a huge insight, okay, on what might be sensible policies in those situations. The fact that there are these constraints gets us to a slightly more interesting sort of point. Okay? The fact that constraints is incredibly important, but in some sense it's arithmetic, so it's sort of boring. Okay? But recognizing the constraints tells us that all of these economic agents face trade-offs. Okay? If you can't just decide you want to spend more on some things and not spend less on something else, you realize you have to spend less on other things to buy more of one thing, you face a trade-off. You have a choice. I might prefer more apples and fewer oranges, or vice versa, but I can't just have more of both. Equivalently, you can say that every choice, every decision to use resources involves an opportunity cost. When you buy one thing, you're losing the opportunity to use those same resources to buy something else. Why do you face that trade-off? Because of the fact that the resources are scarce. Okay? Now, just to make that crystal clear, consider the opposite case. Think about a consumer with infinite income. Well, the consumer just buys whatever it wants. It never has to say, oh, if I spend more on my house, I'll have less to spend on my car. It has an infinite income. It just buys a bigger car and a bigger house. Firms with infinite demand could sell whatever they want. Governments that could borrow without limit could, of course, fund any programs that they wish. But if you state those hypotheticals, it makes it crystal clear that they're insane and that we shouldn't think that way. Also probably reminds you of all the government policies which try to get you to think in that incorrect way. All these economic agents face these constraints, and therefore they face trade-offs. Okay? And that's going to be crucial to what effects government policies might have.
And this last piece, getting back to my conversation with Jeffrey, a little bit more from him on drug legalization.
What I want to talk about tonight is legalizing drugs. As most of you know, countries around the world, there's going to be a disclaimer, hang on. Countries around the world almost entirely outlaw the production, distribution, consumption of marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, so on and so forth. And most of these countries expend very substantial resources in the attempt to enforce those prohibitions. You arrest millions of people, incarcerate many of them, seize tons of assets, build lots of prisons, and so on and so forth. Now, the advocates of current policy of prohibition think that despite the fact that it's expensive, it's worthwhile, and they're relying on two arguments. Their two arguments are drug use is bad, okay, and implicitly, although they frequently forget to say this, they're assuming that prohibition reduces drug use, whether it's bad or not. So the advocates think that there's a benefit from prohibition that outweighs all its cost. I want to argue exactly the opposite based on three fairly simple points. So first, I want to challenge the view that it makes sense for public policy to systematically try to eliminate drug use or to substantially target all drug use. I don't think that's a sensible goal. And the position is simply, many people seem to think that they benefit from using drugs. Sometimes that's medicinally. Sometimes that's recreationally because people like being intoxicated. Sometimes it's because people want to appear cool to their peers or whomever. Okay? Whatever the reason, people go to great lengths, despite all the risks of incarceration and so on, to use drugs because they seem to think that it makes them better off. And in my view, policy should respect that. Now, why do lots of people nevertheless differentiate drugs from all other goods and think that somehow government should discourage drug use when it doesn't try to discourage all sorts of other things, which are also risky? They rely on two main arguments, paternalism and what economists call externalities. The paternalism says drugs are bad for you, but some people will do them anyway because they're myopic or irrational in some way, and we need to protect people from themselves. The externality argument says people may be rational in their own drug use with respect to their own costs and benefits, but they'll inadvertently harm other people by driving under the influence of drugs, by operating an airplane, by taking drugs during pregnancy and harming an unborn fetus, and so on. Now, both of those arguments, that drugs can cause harm, that some people make bad decisions about drugs from their own perspective, some people make bad decisions from the perspective of others, okay? Those arguments are clearly right, but there are two crucial things to note. First, those harms are routinely exaggerated by media scare stories. Yes, of course, drugs can be harmful, but whether they are and how harmful they are depends on the dosage. It depends on the setting. It depends on the expectations of the person using the drugs. It depends on zillions of things, and in many, many cases, okay, there are not significant harms and maybe no harms at all. Indeed, as I mentioned, many people think that they get benefits from using the drugs without any significant harms. Secondly, even granting that there are harms in many cases, there's nothing to distinguish the harms that drugs do from the harms that sometimes occur from alcohol, from skiing on double black diamond slopes, from driving on the highway, from eating too much Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and from zillions of other things that are risky, that are bad for your health or bad for other people if they're done excessively, if they're done in the wrong place, in the wrong time, or maybe at a very young age or whatever, but that can and are used routinely by lots of people for their enjoyment. And so much drug use, okay, should be regarded as just as legitimate as any other good or service in our economy. And at best, policy should be targeting those kinds of use which do harm other people, or perhaps which do harm the user, rather than taking as given that any drug-induced reduction is a desirable goal of policy. Indeed, some of the reduction in drug use that policy might accomplish, that prohibition might accomplish, is a cost, not a benefit, of drug prohibition. Second point. Whatever you think about drug use, good, bad, or indifferent, okay, the question is whether prohibition actually reduces drug use. Even if you think drug use is incredibly evil, if prohibition doesn't have much effect, then that's not a very intelligent policy. Now, of course, it's plausible as a matter of theory that prohibition would discourage people from purchasing drugs because they fear arrest and incarceration, discourage people from supplying drugs by raising the cost of so doing, okay? But the magnitude of that effect is an empirical question. Prohibitionists assume that if drugs were legal, there would be huge booms in drug use. There's not a shred of evidence to support that position. All the evidence suggests that prohibition has some effect, but very modest effects, maybe a 10% effect, maybe a 25% effect. But whatever the exact magnitude, it's not that we would be a nation of addicts, everybody doing drugs all day long. If drugs were legal, the reality seems to be dramatically different. There might be some increases in use by some people, but modest. Remember also, some of any increase should be regarded by policy as a good thing. If people who could use drugs responsibly without harming themselves or others have been abstaining because of prohibition, and then when prohibition is lifted, they decide, well, I might as well now enjoy the substance that I enjoy, that's a benefit of legalization. And so any reduction in use that we observe is partially reducing use that should be allowed that's a good thing, so the net benefit of any reduction is even smaller. Third point, okay, whatever you think about drug use, whatever the evidence says about how much prohibition reduces drug use, what's unequivocal is that prohibition has enormous unintended consequences that are a result of the policy, not the result of drug use per se. Prohibition generates violence. Why? Because in underground markets, people can't resolve their disputes with lawyers and courts and adjudication and so on. They resolve their disputes with guns, so lots more people get shot and die. Prohibition induces corruption because in underground markets you can't have ballot initiatives and lobbyists and so on to influence legislation and so on. So people engage in bribery and the like, okay, in underground markets. Prohibition generates income-generating crime because it raises drug prices, so more people are incentivized to steal to support their habits. Prohibition causes more overdoses and accidental poisonings because quality control is always much worse in a black market than it would be in a legal market. Prohibition spreads HIV because when drug prices are high caused by prohibition, people have an incentive to inject rather than other forms of administration, and prohibition generates restrictions on clean needles, so more people inject drugs rather than consuming in other ways. They share dirty needles and spread HIV. Much of the HIV in the US over the past 20 or so years has come from HIV drug use, not from sexual contact. Prohibition diminishes civil liberties because it's very hard to enforce a victimless crime except with aggressive tactics such as stop and frisk, such as racial profiling, such as knocking doors down in the middle of the night. Okay, so prohibition is bad for our general freedoms. Prohibition encourages restrictions on medical uses of drugs because the prohibitionists are so afraid to allow any legitimate air about drugs, okay, that they don't even want to allow research on the medicinal uses of marijuana. And of course, prohibition also has non-trivial direct costs for enforcement, for all the police officers who make the arrests, for all the judges, for all the prisons, and so on. My estimates suggest that's probably $50 billion a year in recent years in the United States. Prohibition enriches the traffickers at the expense of the general coffers of the government, okay, because we're not collecting normal tax revenues on the underground drug trade. The net effect of that might be another $50 billion a year. So legalizing drugs wouldn't solve America's fiscal problems, but it would put a non-trivial dent, okay, in our fiscal woes. So to summarize, no reasonable view suggests that policy should want to eliminate all drug use or even most drug use. Much drug use should be regarded the same way we regard all other risky activity. People get to choose what they do and what they don't do. Whatever your view, prohibition doesn't seem to be very effective at reducing drug use, so it's pure waste, okay, regardless of whether you think drug use is good or bad. And prohibition has these huge unintended negative effects. Now let me give my disclaimer before I finish. Nothing I've said is meant to say that anybody should or should not use drugs. As long as drugs are illegal, I actually hope you don't use drugs. I don't think people should break the law. They should work to change the laws that they don't like. Okay? So you can't go tell your parents, you can't go say to anyone, Professor Myron said I should use drugs. I got accosted several times the last 5 or 10 years by parents of my kids' friends saying, I caught my kid smoking dope in our basement, and he showed me all these videos of you saying we should legalize drugs. That is not my message. My message is about the policy, not about whether drug use is good or bad for any individual. Okay. That having said, okay, I think it is time for a revolution. It's time for the U.S. to re-legalize drugs.
Again, it's a little unfortunate that we had that technical snafu and lost a few minutes of our conversation, but I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jeffrey. And I hope you go check out his work. What he did tell me in our conversation, the best place to go check his work out, the Cato Institute. He is prolific. You will find all kinds of great papers there under his name. And of course, if you have any questions about my world, any questions about trend following, anything you'd like to know, if you'd like to receive some special extras from me, drop me an email. I'm really easy to reach. Michael@covel.com. My guest today is Jerry Muller. He's the author of many books, including The Mind in the Market, Capitalism in Modern European Thought, Adam Smith in His Time and Ours, and his newest book, the one we're going to talk about today, The Tyranny of Metrics. Jerry poses the point, how the obsession with quantifying human performance threatens our schools, medical care, businesses, and government. An interesting direction for a quantitative guy like me. Someone who is saying very directly that we might have gone too far with the quant of everything. As Jerry says, but in our zeal to instill the evaluation process with scientific rigor, we've gone from measuring performance to fixating on measuring itself. So true, right? By no means is Jerry saying that a quant mindset is bad in of itself. But we can go too far. And I think you're going to see today in this conversation, we have gone too far already in many, many examples in our modern life. And you have to think that if we don't put a stop to some of the metric mindset, it's going to keep going and going to some very bizarre end. Let's jump right in. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jerry Muller. You know, diving into your work right now, I started to think, why did I really have a hard time in high school? Why did I not enjoy it? And we're going back, 20 plus years. Why did I really not enjoy it? And I felt like everything I was doing in high school was about memorization to get to some score, some measurement. And I just kept thinking, where is the stimulation? Where is the inspiration? Give me something that makes me excited. So even going back several decades, I think we've had this measurement problem. But I mean, look at all the students that have to come to your class. Those students have to go study to learn how to take a test, the SAT or the ACTs or whatever, and learn how to take a test. And they spent all this time to do that to get to your class to learn from you.
Yes. So it sounds like your high school was somewhat deficient in developing intrinsic motivation.
But don't you think most are probably?
I'm sure it depends just from one school to another, but from one teacher to another. Of course, there are some things that students need to learn even if they're not motivated. But on the whole, it's important to try to develop the motivation by showing them why a subject is either intrinsically interesting or intrinsically important. That's one of the challenges, I think, of being a teacher. And it's one of the ways in which a test like the SATs, while on the one hand, they're genuinely useful in helping to predict student success in college and university, on the other hand, has the effect of becoming an end in itself in a way that distorts the whole educational process, which is related to one of the themes of my book, the way in which when a particular performance measure becomes the goal in and of itself, it then distorts the incentives of the activity that you're trying to measure.
That was my roundabout way of getting you to say that.
Okay.
That's really where it's at. And I just, because I'm kind of like the opposite of what most kids today, they get motivated by, I must get this score because this will predict my life success. I was the opposite way. I was kind of like the rebel without a cause who then just went the entirely different direction. It's worked out fine for me, no complaints. I really relate to you mapping out these scenarios in your work. I look at kids today that must be on that train to where it is get the score and the learning part isn't as important really as just getting the score.
In my book, one of the things that I discuss in the education section is the problem of teaching to the test, which is a form of gaming, essentially. Gaming being a kind of behavior where You orient your behavior towards the particular thing that's being measured at the price of the purpose for which it's being measured. But there's a sense in which high school students or college students can study to the test, be it the SATs or some other test, or even spend hours and hours and thousands of dollars practicing for the test in a way that distorts what the test is ultimately supposed to test, namely your general knowledge and your analytic ability. It's much better to spend more of your time reading a wide variety of things, including ones that aren't assigned for your high school class, reading a good quality newspaper every day, and so on, to develop your mind intellectually. And some of that will be reflected on the test. But meanwhile, you'll have reached a genuinely significant goal, namely becoming an educated person.
Well, what we're really going down the path of here is going to talk about metrics and the growing use of metrics, the growing quantification of society. And I must share with you that one of the reasons we're talking is because in the last 10, 15 years, I've written several books about quantitative trading and quantitative trading to turn a profit. And it works exceptionally well. It works exceptionally well in the narrow niche of saying, hey, I will use this limited data set to make buy and sell decisions and profit over a long period of time. It works fantastic. However, getting beyond my little narrow world here, if we expand that out to where we are trying to put a quant view on everything, it kind of leaves us as an author, and you're going to probably start to know this already, is Amazon. I mean, Amazon is all about gaming the system, people pushing rankings, pushing metrics, reviews that could be real, reviews that could be fake. There's so much gaming, right? And so what I'm leading to is I want you to describe this great example, because it's a really scary example, is the gaming of the medical profession via metrics. Because the doctors, my father's a doctor, doctors are so concerned about how they're measured, how they're judged in a quantified way. It's leading to a lot of unintended consequences, isn't it?
Doctors are legitimately concerned with what I call metric fixation. By metric fixation, I mean a combination of three things. One is the notion that you're going to replace judgment based upon experience with standardized quantitative measures that don't require experience or don't require judgment. So that's the first thing, is these standardized performance measures. And then linked to that is the second element, the idea of reward and punishment, that you're going to attach rewards and punishments to those standardized measures of performance. And those rewards or punishments can be monetary, but they can also be reputational in the form of rankings and ratings. And of course, rankings and ratings can have effects in the real world. And that's connected then to the third idea, and that is that you are going to publicize these standardized performance metrics in the name of what's often called accountability. So one of the early ways in which this was tried in the medical system was that some states in the United States, like New York State, began to gather standardized performance data and publicize it on the record of surgeons performing certain standard operations, hip replacements or knee replacements or standardized kinds of heart surgery. When they started to do this, so they would gather the data and then they would put it on a website that indicated the relative degree of success or failure of each surgeon on that kind of procedure. What then started to happen is that surgeons started to engage in what we call creaming or cherry picking. That is to say, they simply refused to operate on patients where the risk of failure was greater because the patients had comorbidities or some other problem. So on the one hand, it improved their scores or kept their scores good, depending on what the case may be. What the people looking at the scores from the outside wouldn't see was the patients who were never operated on because they were considered too risky because they might die. And then, of course, they often did die without the surgery. That's one of many kinds of gaming behavior that one finds in the medical field. Or to take a case from the National Health Service in Great Britain that's become kind of famous for people who study these sorts of things. There's a lot of this metric madness or metric fixation in Britain, by the way, in both the educational system and the healthcare system. So the NHS, the National Health Service, was concerned because patients were concerned about the amount of time that they had to wait in the emergency room before they were admitted. And the NHS told hospitals that they would be monetarily penalized if patients had to wait in the waiting room for more than 4 hours. Well, that sounds eminently reasonable, and metrics seems like a magic bullet. But here's what sometimes happened. When patients were being brought in by ambulance, the administrators in the emergency wards would tell the ambulance to keep circling around with the patients in them until the patients could be admitted and seen within 4 hours. So the people that suffered there were the other patients who were sitting at home waiting for an ambulance to come, but the ambulances weren't available, but the administrators in the emergency wards hit their metric goals. So that's another example, rather radical example of this.
Well, these medical examples are frightening.
Yes, they are. And then what's interesting is the way in which the system of metrics is sometimes set up in a way that encourages or even requires this kind of gaming behavior. I mean, there are scores and scores of them because hospitals and doctors are remunerated on the basis of standardized codes for each condition. There's tremendous incentives for what they call upcoding. That is, classifying the patient as having a somewhat more serious condition than he or she actually has. And in fact, I've been told that when medical residents are being trained, one of the things that they're told is the importance of upcoding, or certainly not downcoding, because the hospital wants to be rewarded on the highest possible basis. So I'm not against all measurement. Measurement is necessary and often useful, but there are these predictable kinds of unintended negative consequences that often come with performance metrics.
You know, I've done this podcast for many years, 600 plus episodes. I've talked to many of your peers in the academic community, and this is one of those aha moments where I'm sure my audience is going to be just like I am right now, which is just like jaw open, tongue hanging out, like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, it's frightening. I keep saying frightening, but it's true.
I want to be clear, Michael, that measurement can really be useful. It depends on who's using it and how. So, for example, in the medical field, if you gather this comparative information on how various surgeons or how various surgical units are doing in terms of their success rate on various procedures, and then you make that information available to the actors themselves, that is, the doctors and nurses themselves, so that they can compare how they've done to how their peers are doing, and you remove the element of reward and punishment, and you remove the element of making this information public. So the people who see it are the actual practitioners. They can then use that to analyze and diagnose what they're doing right and wrong. And in that sense, measurement can be really useful, but people often confuse the use of measurement for diagnosis by practitioners themselves with the use of measurement for external accountability and for external reward and punishment.
As an end user, though, if I have to deal with the medical community in the not too distant future for some particular reason, as an end user trying to go by these metrics, is it fair to say that it's just really impossible to know?
Yes. You need a lot of experience and judgment to know which metrics that you see on some hospital website are actually relevant and what the extenuating circumstances are. In other words, the idea of metric fixation is to provide easily assimilated numbers for audiences. But in fact, it takes a lot of sophistication to understand the significance of the numbers, whether they're distorted, in what direction, and so on. You know, if you see a hospital that has 4 stars instead of 5, it could be that that's because it's located in an area with a difficult patient population. That is, people who aren't in good health for a variety of reasons. Unless you know that, you don't really know that 4 stars might be better than some hospital located in some suburban location where they get 5 stars, but they get 5 stars in part because their patient population is very healthy.
Let me shift you back to something really quick because it just kind of struck me, which is we were talking about the scores, the SATs, the ACTs. If I ask this question to most people, I'm sure we get a pretty standard answer. But you seem like a pretty interesting guy, so I'm going to ask the question, and I want you to really give me your honest, heartfelt, deep down perspective on this particular question. What is smart to you? How do you measure smart? What's your measurement of smart? How do you go about that?
Some of it is general in terms of IQ, that is your general ability to take in information, spot patterns, apply knowledge that you've gotten from one place to extrapolate it to another place. So there's that kind of generalized intelligence, IQ, and of course that has subdivisions of its own, visual, verbal, and spatial. And the numerical, all of those kinds of qualities are important, but then there's other kinds of intelligence that have to do often with experience in a particular field and knowing how to make use of or apply knowledge that you've acquired and actually make it work in the field. That kind of knowledge, as I say, often comes from experience.
Hard to quantify that kind of knowledge.
It is hard to quantify that kind of knowledge. Yes, that's right. That's one of the general points of the book, too. A lot of the most important things in life and a lot of the most important things in organizations are unquantifiable. So the fact that something is quantifiable does not make it important, and the fact that something is important doesn't make it necessarily easily measurable.
There's so many topic areas that I want to go into with you, but I'm in my 40s, late 40s. I've got some kind of like techie friends in their 20s and 30s. The guys that are in the tech space almost can't think like the way that you're giving the alternative view in the tyranny of metrics. They almost can't go that way because they have been so structured into metrics. And they've gotten rewarded by this, though, honestly. A lot of guys have made a bloody fortune by just going by these metrics. But to me, every time I have these conversations, it's like talking to robots.
Yes, well, of course, that's what they aspire to be, is human algorithms.
I've read in some books about this kind of thing. You just correctly said a few minutes ago, you said there are some great ways we have used quantifying in our lives, in business, and in life and everything, but it can go too far.
One of the effects of quantification, which is so widely, on the one hand, so widely taught in business schools and also is so widely applied in trading firms who, sometimes hire people with PhDs in physics and engineering for their math ability. One of the effects of that emphasis on quantification is that it has a negative effect on entrepreneurship and innovation, because it's the nature of innovation that you're trying something new. You're trying some new product or some new method, some new system of distribution, and it's the nature of trying something new that you don't know whether it's going to work. So you can't calculate it in advance. So insofar as investors and investing institutions, or even venture capitalists, insofar as they focus on the quantitative, what can you show me is going to be the market for this product in 5 years, they're going to turn down those products where the answer is, we're not sure because this is a new kind of product and we can't actually calculate how great the market for it will be. So in that sense, there's a sense in which this emphasis on quantification is anti-innovative and anti-entrepreneurial. It tends to lead to going with more of the same in some larger degree.
It's anti-creative.
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things that worries me in terms of its larger economic effects. But of course, that kind of creativity and entrepreneurialism also exists within all kinds of organizations that are not profit-making organizations. Government organizations, government departments, and so on. They require also some people who are creative and innovative, and in that sense are entrepreneurial, within that realm. But if everybody is told that you have to meet these standardized performance targets and you're going to be rewarded and punished accordingly, then it leaves less room for innovation and it leaves less room for risk taking. As you probably agree, a lot of the creative things in life require a good deal of risk taking. So, to take one example that I cite in the book, the person in the U.S. counterterrorism community who was in charge of those analysts who worked on trying to find bin Laden for a number of years, year after year, they were working on it and didn't find him. Their superior said, all right, I'll take the risk. I'll let these analysts continue to work on this project because my experience, my judgment indicates that they might very well find him. But the risk is that they could have worked for years and not had any performance metrics to show for it. And then, of course, finally, they did find him and there was a big payoff. But that's often the case in life, that big payoffs require risk, and risk involves the unquantifiable.
I was just thinking about an example of the creativity meeting the quant and how it's going down. For example, Hollywood. It used to be that the Francis Ford Coppola, the Oliver Stone, Steven Spielberg, they would take chances and do these crazily different movies. Today, all we have is Superman 63 and Spider-Man 24.
Right. So there's a close link, of course, between quantification and the formulaic. And what you're describing in Hollywood is the fact that studios have become formulaic. That is, they have standardized formulas of how long a script is supposed to be, where in that script action is supposed to occur, and how often, and so on. And in their defense, one of the results is because they take less risks, because everything is so formulaic, they have fewer turkeys, fewer really great failures. On the other hand, they have fewer great films, because great films are almost by definition non-formulaic.
It's all just superhero films. If you're into superhero films, it's a great time to be alive.
Well, I think it applies to romance stories and so on as well, this propensity to use formulas and only accept scripts that conform to those formulas.
Let me shift you. I'm going to go into government in a second because I want to tie some of these things together. There's another great example, which as big an aha moment for me as reading on the medical side of what you're exposing, the measurement tyranny of metrics, which is law enforcement. I mean, look, medical, law enforcement, but they're both situations where we could have a loss of life unnaturally. But why don't you map out kind of big picture? It goes off in a lot of different angles what's going on in law enforcement. And it starts with the crime statistics, doesn't it?
Yes. One of the attractions of metric fixation is that it appears to be that if you have some problem in your city or in your school system or whatever, it appears to be a silver bullet. It appears like a surefire solution. Let's say there's a problem of crime, which there indeed often is in cities, and the problem is sufficient that it becomes a political issue. Then the elected mayor will tell the police chief, unless I can show that I've reduced the crime rate by 5%, I'm going to be challenged in the next election. So you, the police chief, have to lower the crime rate by 5%. So the police chief then takes that to the people below him, the people who are the commanders of precincts, and say, we have to lower crime by 5%. And they in turn take it to the cops on the beat and say, you have to lower crime by 5%. But what they can do is lower the reporting of crime by 5%. Crimes can be reported to them by citizens and they can simply not record it. Or what happens more often is that they take crimes that ought to be major crimes and they get reported in the FBI statistics like larceny, and they report it as a misdemeanor, as minor theft or something like that. So you can reduce the crime rate by reducing the seriousness of the crimes that are reported without actually reducing crime. Or to take another example, when cops are evaluated or the police system is evaluated according to the number of arrests and prosecutions, it creates incentives to arrest a lot of low-level people and not high-level criminals who it might take many years to develop a case against. But if you arrest that top criminal, that only counts as one in the metric, whereas if you arrest some fellow selling dope on the street, that also counts as one, and that's a lot easier. So the incentives then are to engage in a lot of low-level arrests and not engage in the kind of concerted long-term police work that would lead to arresting the top people in the crime family or syndicate.
How did you start to put this kind of information together with law enforcement? Because I've got some experience with local government law enforcement, and usually getting information that they don't want to give, they'll hide it under some exclusion, or they'll make it difficult with FOIA laws, or perhaps even these big decisions that you're talking about are never even, they're supposed to be written down, they're supposed to be established in minutes and records, but some of these decisions at local government can just be kind of like something off to the side where the mayor and the chief just kind of say, hey, here's what we got to do. How did you start to piece this together, though?
As the most useful way of starting to understand it is by insider accounts, that is, by people who have been there and done that. And one of the places in which this was originally called to my attention in the realm of policing is through the HBO drama The Wire, which was written by two people, one of whom had been a cop in Baltimore, the other of whom had been a reporter. They drew upon their own experience in portraying what I call metric fixation in a wide variety of realms, including in policing. A lot of the series focuses on the drug trade, and there the detectives are told deliberately, we have to clear more cases, and if you emphasize trying to catch the top drug lord in town, that's going to take a lot of your time. But if we arrest the people who are actually selling drugs on the street, we can have a much better rate of arrests. And similarly, the series also deals in policing in the realm of murder, where the issue becomes then the clearance rate. So how many murders are there, and how many do you actually solve? And there's an incident in the series where they come across some really dastardly drug suppliers who are murdering substantial numbers of people in a neighborhood and burying them in abandoned houses. And they're told, well, let's not go into these houses, because if we find the bodies, we're not going to be able to solve the case. It's going to lower our clearance rate. So let's not do it. In the realm of policing, it was first called to my attention by this dramatic series, which, as I say, is based on insider knowledge. And then I read some of the scholarship on policing and articles on policing, including testimony by various policemen and ex-policemen who testify to the fact that this kind of gaming of the metrics goes on in cities across the United States, but also in Great Britain and in many other countries. It's quite a ubiquitous phenomenon.
Yeah, I would think on the local level with the local politicians, the local law enforcement, it's not, they're probably not exactly happy that Jerry's coming along and saying, hey, guys, look behind the curtain here, how the sausage is made on the local level. I'm sure some people are not happy about that.
Right. Some people aren't. But on the other hand, one of the things that this misuse of performance metrics does is it makes the actual practitioners very dissatisfied, unhappy, and demotivated.
You talked about teachers feeling that way too, big time.
I've talked about teachers, but since publishing the book, I've gotten letters from former police officials saying, Jerry, thank you for writing this, but if anything, you've understated it in the case of policing. And I get letters every week also, not letters anymore, but emails from physicians, especially retired physicians or recently retired physicians, telling me how much this kind of metric fixation has distorted the practice of medicine. The truth is that, one of the reasons I wrote the book is that there are a lot of people working in organizations, in public corporations that are profit-oriented, in government, in education, in medicine, who have a tremendous degree of frustration because this kind of metric fixation stands in the way of them doing what they think is actually important, namely the purpose of the organization, like healing the sick or reducing crime and increasing public safety and so on. And one of the purposes of the book really was to help these people articulate in systematic form what's wrong with the organizational culture in which they've had to operate.
And to be clear, this is not meant to be that you are, a Luddite from when it comes to quantifying things. You're simply saying perhaps we've gone way too far. We need to reel it back and use a combination of judgment, experience, and the quantitative data.
Exactly. Because the truth is you need experience in order to figure out which things are worth measuring, in order to figure out which things you can't measure. And then once you have the data, in order to understand how relatively important the things are that you've measured compared to the things that you can't measure. So in all those ways, standardized measurement can be really useful when it's combined with experience and when it's combined with judgment. What I'm concerned about is the many cases, or the ever greater propensity in our culture to try to eliminate the role of experience and judgment in favor of these standardized performance metrics.
Let me run into kind of a tangential type direction also in your work. Today, we've got these CEOs that seemingly can go from industry to industry. They don't even need to know anything about media or engineering or whatever. As long as they're an expert at the metrics, they can just be plopped in, boom, boom, boom. That's a fairly interesting direction that metrics have gone down too, because it used to be, for example, if you were in the car industry, you were probably a lifer, you came along, you knew every last detail of it. And many of the car companies in America, guys and ladies started at the very bottom, worked their way up. And that's been pretty typical across the world in companies. But that is kind of changed now. We're kind of got these rock star metric guys that kind of jump between disciplines pretty regularly, huh?
Yes, I would say that's one of the deeper pathologies behind all this, is this kind of ideology of managerialism. That is, in order to manage a company or a government agency or a university, you don't really need depth of experience that would develop your judgment over time. What you need is a mastery of certain managerial tools, and those tools are content neutral. That is to say, they're quantitative. If you're the head of one company that makes one sort of thing and you go to be the head of a different company that does something in an entirely different area, the notion is you can do it because you can take the same managerial tools, the same performance metrics, the same reward and punishment for performance, and you can apply it. The result of this kind of managerial ideology, is severalfold. One is, you look at the new person comes in, he's used to a certain system from his previous company or that he learned in business school. He sees that system isn't in place in the new company. So what's the first thing he does? He calls in the consultants, and the consultants are there to help him find new ways of accumulating data and analyzing it. I mean, there are some consultants who are, of course, expert in particular areas, but there are other consultants whose real expertise is in these kind of standardized metric tools. And then the second effect of it is if this manager comes in from, or CEO comes in from some other company, he wants to demonstrate how clever and talented he is, so that when the headhunter calls, he'll have metrics to show. So what's he going to do? He's going to try to improve the quarterly profit. And what's the fastest way of improving the quarterly profit? Is by cost cutting. So you cut back on staff, you cut back on capital expenditure, and so on. All of what's the hardest thing to understand when you come to a new company or a new industry or a new university? R&D, research and development, because there you got to really understand what's actually being made and produced. So the propensity is to increase profits short term by cutting back on R&D, cutting back on staff, and so on, in a way that's often demoralizing for people in the organization, even though it makes some investors who are oriented towards the very short term happy. But it's bad for the long-term productivity of the company, of the university, and hence of the economy as a whole.
It's really difficult to argue with you. I want to do a little bit of a momentary sidebar, unrelated to the book, but kind of connected to the book. It's a line that you had in your materials that I caught somewhere, and I would love for you to explain this. As a special bonus to my book, The Tyranny of Metrics, I have not provided any PowerPoint slides, believing them to be a distraction from complex ideas. Now, as a guy who's taken the stage quite a bit, and the audiences, they all want the damn PowerPoint presentations, right? You know, and they often want these things in advance from me. And I tell people, I say, listen, I'm not giving you my slides in advance. You're not going to get them in advance to give people to print out, to stare at them while I talk. It's not happening. Not doing it. You seem to be a cousin of my belief here, but I like the way you explain it. Why don't you give your rationale?
Okay, so that was only half tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, I know you believe this.
Yes, I do believe it. A major business guru had just published a new book, and he tweeted about the fact that you could get the PowerPoint slides for it as an accompaniment to the book. So I tweeted back. Not tweeted back, but I tweeted it as an additional bonus to my book. There weren't any PowerPoint slides because they detract from understanding. I have no doubt that there are occasions where PowerPoint slides are useful if used in a scrupulous way, primarily to demonstrate or to show some sort of quantitative analysis, a graph or a chart or something like that. By and large, I think the overuse of PowerPoint decreases the actual intake of understanding in lectures. And one of the reasons that it does that is because the lecturers who focus on the PowerPoint don't learn the basic techniques of lecturing, namely to speak in such a way that people are interested in what you're saying.
Basically, the speakers just read their slides.
Right. That's right. They're reading their slides, and there's really nothing more boring in the world than that. And you didn't really have to come to the talk to hear them read their slides. I mean, there's some things that are conveyed perfectly well without hearing a speaker. But the point of being a speaker is that you have to be able to arouse and hold the interest of your audience in the way in which you lay out your argument, in the way in which you use your voice, in the way in which you circle back to certain key points to underline it in their minds. So I think that expertise, as a broad generalization, probably expertise in PowerPoint use and expertise in public speaking are inversely correlated.
I generally, for a PowerPoint, because most events want this kind of stuff, I generally will do something maybe 20 or so, usually just an image. And so I'll put the image up and, no notes or anything. And then I'll go with the image and use that as kind of like some flavor, some sauce to go with what I'm saying. But there's no words that they can sit there and read and go, okay, I'm listening to Mike and I'm reading Mike and I'm listening Mike and I'm reading Mike. It's crazy.
Yes, right. That's right. In that sense, using images, cartoons or other kinds of images can be genuinely useful in holding the audience's attention. Yeah. We both agree that that's not typically the way in which PowerPoint slides are used.
No, typically PowerPoint slides are used by some functionary at some corporation, somebody who has zero public speaking skills. Perhaps they've done well in the company, whatever. They put a nice suit on, they stand at the podium, they look down, they read it, and everybody in the audience acts like at the end of 30 minutes it was a good presentation, even though most people wanted to kill themselves.
Right. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that the PowerPoint slide tail starts to wag the lecture dog. So I've seen speakers who are very knowledgeable and intelligent and capable of speaking well, who lose all sense of spontaneity and so on because they feel committed to getting through all their slides.
So we talk about all the metrics, right? And so let's go to, actually, you know what? I'll make it two smaller ones. First, we've been kind of talking USA, you mentioned Great Britain, but this notion of metrics, it goes well beyond the States. For example, China. I mean, as far as I understand with China is all about the metric. They want to have basically a number on your forehead to judge you ongoing, the duration of your life.
Right. So, my book has been out for about 2 months now, and among the languages that it's in the process of being translated into is simplified Chinese for the mainland market and traditional Chinese for the Taiwan market. And I think that happened in part because these metrics are so ubiquitous in Chinese life. They put the Chinese government, the mainland government, put a lot of emphasis on developing metrics for their universities to try to get them top ranked within world rankings. And they created a metric evaluation system that was just based upon science and engineering, because to judge a whole university, because that's what they're really interested in. And promotions there are heavily based upon the number of articles that you publish and so on. And one of the effects that has had is that it leads to a tremendous amount of gaming, both in the sense of faking results in order to get published articles, and also a phenomenon that you find elsewhere in the world of science too, as these metric evaluations have become more and more important. People take research and they cut it up into as many articles as possible in order to increase the number of articles, but at the expense of the significance of the articles and their efficiency in conveying what the research has actually been. Yeah, metrics are by no means just a matter of Great Britain and the United States. I'm not sure why, but I see that my book seems to be selling very well in Australia, and I get the impression that metrics, this kind of metric fixation, has become ubiquitous there too. And then, as you say, the Chinese government wants to try to measure everything and give people these credit scores based on algorithms. There's obviously something problematic about that, but I
coming to America soon, right?
Yeah. I haven't researched it in sufficient depth to, have a novel opinion about it yet.
We've now got this, as you point out, this overload on metrics. But, look, it is the hand we've been dealt. And so if we take it to the public policy realm, we take it to the government realm, and we can look at just every aspect of public policy. And we've talked about some of the things today, from school to medical. And just imagine what happens when you get into the bowels of Congress in Washington, D.C., when all of these folks are using metrics. Either side is using a metric to try and make their case, to make their point. But you end up, it seems like if you kind of just blur your eyes and take a step back, you end up with this kind of soup of nothing. And so all this big picture creativity, for example, hey, here's something about China that do really well. They're building high-speed rail. Hey, where's the high-speed rail in America? Okay, why can't we just build the high-speed rail? Because we've probably got every metric in the world that tells us that the best that we can do is the Acela from DC to New York, so we can't build high-speed rail. Who knows what the reasons are? But I think there is, from a public policy standpoint, I'd love for you to comment on this, a public policy standpoint, you have creativity on one side, you have risk-taking on the other, and then you have all these metrics on the other side. And all those metrics on the other side, I think they definitely help to stagnate a society.
Well, I'll tell you what I see as the greatest lure, in a negative sense, of this metric fixation. And that is, look, every society, and certainly American society, has lots of problems. In some places, the crime rate really is too high. The K-12 education system doesn't educate people as well as we would like. The level of spending on healthcare is high as a percentage of GNP in a way that invades people's budgets and the profitability of businesses and so on. So there are lots of real problems in any society, and certainly in American society. What worries me most in many ways about metric fixation is that it seems to be a silver bullet. It seems to be a solution to every problem. But often and sometimes, again, if the metrics are used in a diagnostic way, they can be genuinely helpful. But if they're used together with publicity, with accountability and pay for performance, they can often be counterproductive in ways that I have started to describe in our discussion here, and in many more ways as well. So what worries me is the fact that this is so often seen as the solution for every problem. And then if you say, as I do, often it exacerbates the problem or it creates new problems. Then people will say, but you don't have a better solution, so we have to use this one. But the truth is that the fact that there's a problem doesn't necessarily mean that there's a solution, or doesn't mean that there's a solution that's not going to either make the problem worse or create new problems of its own. And that's something that's pretty hard for people in a liberal democratic society to accept. And it's, of course, not something that politicians can say. They can't say, yeah, I recognize there's a problem, but I've analyzed this, I've read the best literature on it, and it's pretty clear to me that there's actually no solution to it.
Well, if I was to think in trading terms, I could think about variability, volatility, randomness. These are all natural things. And perhaps what you're really describing is the societal effort, the public policy effort to try and optimize every last thing to some peak on the plane that doesn't even exist. It's imaginary. We're never going to get there, but we go down these steps pretending we're going to get there when, frankly, most people that are making these decisions know we're never going to get there, but we still go through the process anyways.
And there's always people who want to sell you their secret formula. Just hire their consulting firm or just buy their book, and that's going to be the formula that's going to solve all your problems. So there's always people selling solutions. There's not that many people like me analyzing the problems with the solutions.
Cool stuff, Jerry. Appreciate it. The Tyranny of Metrics is available everywhere. Jerry, is there a website we can send people to?
Princeton University Press has a website, and you can then search for The Tyranny of Metrics, or you can go to my I'm represented by, for speaking purposes, by the Lee Bureau, LEIGH. You can go to, they have a very nice website with information about me and about the book and a video of talks that I've given about it and so on.
Jerry, again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I still own a house in Vienna, Virginia, even though I'm calling you from Asia. So I'm kind of close to you and kind of not close to you.
Well, it's been good to talk to you.
I'm not in college. I'm not at university. I'm not in grad school. I'm not pursuing my PhD. But it sort of feels like I am. But here's the tricky part. I'm not in some niche, right? I get to talk to everyone. It's the coolest damn thing. Now, here's a little secret about how I pursue my process. I think everybody I talk to is connected in some way, at least in my maniacal mind. I think it's all connected because it starts with skepticism. You start with skepticism, you go down a path, and you figure out an aha moment. And then you're left with something really cool that's useful for everyone, regardless of their endeavor in life. Oh, you're a trader, you're a trend-following trader, you're a short-term trader, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business person, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer. Hey, guess what? Oh, I forgot one also. You're a student. You're just a regular person. You're working at Starbucks. The episode today, I would like to make the argument that all of my episodes are the same in this context. But this episode today, it's for everyone. Because the topic of the conversation is something that we all have to deal with every day or we die. And what's that? Sleep. My guest today is Matthew Walker, British scientist, professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on the impact of sleep on human health and disease. I got lucky. I randomly caught Matt on Joe Rogan's show. Did not know anything about Matt, had not seen his book, dropped him an email, and I quickly realized that Matt is talking to a lot of people right now. He is getting this message out. So I was so happy that I'm kind of a little late to the party, but Matt graciously responded, said, sure, I'll come on the podcast. Once again, I'm a lucky guy to be able to have all these expert minds on. And we are all lucky too, because you know what? Today, I'm giving you the absolute best way you can increase your performance. That's one aspect. And increase all of those things that connect to your human biology, your lifespan, your potential for disease, controlling and shaping your own DNA. Yeah, it's all through sleep. And my guest today, Matthew Walker, he's really laid down the gauntlet with all of us. You can listen or you can not listen. And for those of you that don't listen, what's wrong with you? I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Matthew Walker. So Matthew, in preparation for talking to you today, I did one little post on my Facebook. I said, hey, I actually didn't even say I was going to be having initially a conversation with anybody. I just said, look, if you're only getting 6 hours a night and you think it's enough, it's not enough. A fairly innocuous type statement. You would think most people instinctively know this, right? Oh my gosh, over 100 comments, got people in there screaming and yelling. You would have thought I had thrown down the gauntlet. One of the things that someone said as I kind of lead into this question, which was really interesting, is they said, well, you know, Tony Robbins has come out. And I love Tony Robbins. I think he's great things to say. You know, he says, Tony comes out, he says, he only gets like, 5 or 6 or less or something at peak optimization. He works fine at it. It works for him. Now, of course, there's always the outliers and the bell curve and all that kind of fun stuff. But I thought to myself, all of this angst that was existing on my Facebook thread, there was a certain level of machismo, like, I can just outwill this thing. And it felt very testosterone filled, right? And the funny thing is here I have all these guys that are showing their testosterone about how little sleep they need and the reality.
The irony.
Why don't you explain that irony?
Yeah, well, we know that men who are sleeping 6 hours or less a night will actually have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. That insufficient sleep that they are so proudly boasting about is actually serving to age them by a decade in terms of that aspect of virility and wellness. So unfortunately, the data is not supportive. And I would like to come back to the comment about those outliers, maybe Tony Robinson, people have before quoted to me Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, all short sleepers. The danger there is you're taking a sample of one person and then you're trying to apply it to the masses, rather than actually taking tens of thousands of scientific studies and looking at what those studies actually tell you. So I would tend to suggest people follow trend lines and not headlines. And headlines in this case is an individual. Trend lines is the science. And by the way, you noted too that people are fighting against this evolutionary mandate of 8 hours of sleep a night. And all I would say is that if science has taught us anything, whenever you fight biology, you normally lose. And the way that you know you've lost is through disease and sickness.
That was the thing that seemed to be missing on the responses to me, is the guys kept coming back about performance. I can kind of just push through to get to the performance. And I kept saying, hey, hold on. What about the biological elements going on here? They weren't even considering the aging, the potential dementia, the Alzheimer's, the high blood pressure, the potential heart attacks, cancer risks. They weren't even considering that. It was only, I can push through to the performance.
Well, I think the phrase push through is critical here. Are you optimal or are you just pushing through? And second, one of the other things that we know is that your subjective sense of how well you're doing when you're not getting sufficient sleep is a miserable predictor of objectively actually how well you are doing when you're not getting enough sleep. In other words, you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So I think the analogy would be, a drunk driver at a bar. They've had 6 shots and they pick up their car keys. They say, look, I'm fine to drive home. And your response is, no, I know that subjectively you think you're fine to drive, but trust me, objectively, you're not. It's the same way with insufficient sleep. And that's why I usually imagine people who say those things truly just don't understand the performance deficit at that stage.
Let's start with a big picture. We've talked about numbers for a moment, but I think it'll really help those people that are unfamiliar with your work, unfamiliar with, frankly, the right way to sleep. Let's talk about that optimal number. I think I've seen you say the range is 7 to 9. Anything below 7, you can measure the impairment.
That's right. Yeah. So we know that once average human beings drop below that 7 number, that's when we can actually observe changes both in the brain and the body. But for example, if I were to put an individual on 7 hours of sleep for 3 weeks, at that stage, they would be as impaired in terms of their driving performance as they would be after one night of total sleep deprivation after going without sleep for 36 hours. So it's like compounding interest on a loan. It just aggregates and aggregates.
Hold on, you said it's 7 hours it does that.
Yeah. We know that 1 out of every 2 people in most developed nations is actually trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. If I take you down to that level, it only takes 2 weeks to become as cognitively impaired as you would be after pulling an all-nighter.
Yeah, the all-nighter thing, I think back to my college days as a professor. You might laugh at this, but never one time, and I wasn't the greatest student, but that's a whole different issue, but never one time did I attempt to pull an all-nighter because instinctively, even though I did not have the knowledge that exists in your work, instinctively I knew I was useless if I tried to stay up all night.
Exactly that. And you can see that in performance. We did a study where we asked, in terms of learning and memory, is it a good idea to pull the all-nighter? So we took 2 groups of healthy adults. We gave one group a full night of sleep, the other we sleep deprived. And then we looked at how well they could cram facts into the brain the next day. And firstly, what we found is that when you are sleep deprived, your brain is 40% worse at learning new material. So 40. To put that in context of an exam, it would be the difference between acing it and failing it miserably. But what we also found, which was quite disturbing, is why the learning change was associated with a change in the brain. And specifically, there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is almost like a memory inbox for the brain. That part of your brain was actually shut down when you were sleep deprived. So any new incoming memories were just being bounced. So you couldn't effectively commit new experiences to memory.
It is absolutely fascinating, the path that you've gone down. And before I dig even deeper, I want you to paint for me the passion. Now, you're my second psych guest from Berkeley. I had Alison Gopnik on, and she was great.
Wonderful.
She was fantastic. But what has been the driver for you? I want to lay this foundation. You're a very passionate guy. You've obviously gone down this, as an outsider looking in, I look at this path and I'm like, it's just so cool to see somebody go down a path that many people are not exploring and put something out that, frankly, I don't care where somebody sits on the political spectrum. This is useful information for everyone. And gosh, in such a polarized society, it's nice to have something where we can all perhaps say, oh my gosh, we can all talk about this. How did you get this passion? How did this start for you?
I think for a number of different reasons. Firstly, we know now that I think the global sleep loss epidemic is perhaps one of the greatest public health challenges that we now face in the 21st century. And I don't make that statement flippantly. We've got remarkable health challenges. We've got obesity, diabetes, we've got cancer, Alzheimer's disease. All of those individual disease states are desperately problematic. The issue, however, is that a lack of sleep sits like a superordinate node above all of those things. It's linked to every single disease that is killing us in the developed world, insufficient sleep. So by itself, it, I think, consumes more lives relative to any one of those in isolation. That was the first thing. The second thing was that if you look at this decline of sleep, this great depression of sleep over the last 100 years, it's staggering. Gallup did a poll in 1942, and they demonstrated that the average American adult was sleeping 7.9 hours a night. Now that number is down to only 6 hours and 31 minutes. In other words, within the space of 80 or 90 years, we have lopped off almost 20% of this mandated sleep need. It took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to put this essential thing called 8 hours of sleep in place. And we've just done away with, 20%, 25% of that. How could it not come with demonstrable health consequences, which it is? I just felt as though that message has not been adequately communicated to the public. So let me come back to your Twitter feed. A lot of people just didn't understand why proclaiming how they are doing fine on 6 hours and not worrying about the disease risk. Part of the reason is not just the sleep machismo attitude, which there is, and it's a problem, but it's the fault of people like me. I have not done or had not done a good job of describing the science of sleep, which we have known now for almost 30 years. And I think we are with our lack of sleep where we were with smoking 30 or 40 years ago. We knew all of the science, the carcinogenic, the cardiovascular consequences, but that data had not been out there. So society had not changed its beliefs and attitudes and behavior. It was only when science took 30 years to finally communicate publicly that data did we make a change, and we saved millions of lives. That's what needs to happen with sleep. That was the motivation to write the book. That's been the motivation to become much more of a public figure. I'm a very introverted person. Normally, I don't like being in the spotlight, but I feel so compelled because the disease and suffering that is present in the world right now because of our lack of sleep is so painful. It's not necessary. It's one of the greatest preventable diseases that nobody is talking about and no one is trying to solve.
We're going to have to talk about a lot of different things today that are just eye-opening, and perhaps somebody could frame it as negative. I look at your work, and I've actually seen you kind of say, hey, you've talked to audiences and you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to throw a lot of things at you today that might sound heavy, might not sound so nice. But there's another way to kind of look at this too, that once one absorbs your work, it's like, okay, oh my gosh, if I make certain choices, I get this performance boost that helps me on the performance of what I want to do in my life. It helps me on how long I want to live. How long I want to live, if I'm looking at your work correctly, is, from a bell curve perspective, is a choice when it comes to sleep, isn't it?
It's absolutely a choice. For most people, I think for some people, it may not be a choice. And I specifically am talking about people with sleep disorders where that obviously isn't a choice. And also some people from a socioeconomic perspective may just not be given through their work pressures the ability to sleep. But for the most part, I would say 90 to 95% of people who are underslept can do something about that. And you're right about the lifespan issue. What we know is the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicts all-cause mortality. If you adopt that mindset of this idea, I can sleep when I'm dead, well, it is mortally unwise advice, and you will be both dead sooner and the quality of your now shorter life will be significantly worse. That's what epidemiological studies teach us.
Matthew, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years going back in America, and it's different for other countries, but America's had this huge debate about healthcare and whether the healthcare should be private or public. And these debates, I can understand the different positions on different sides of the fences and all that kind of stuff. But what I never hear is something tangible. I never hear like a politician or a leader come out and start to talk about something like sleep. We can sit here, you and I can have this intellectual conversation about this, how important it is. It doesn't make a difference whether somebody is on the right or left. This is just fact. And how we can't get that to a higher level conversation where literally the leaders of the free world should be giving national speeches about this topic, in my humble opinion. Am I completely nuts?
No, if the goal of any head of a nation is to try and improve the wealth and the health and the lifespan of their people, sleep should be one of their top priorities. Absolutely. That's what the data supports. Wealth as well. And I'd love to at some point dive into why less sleep does not equal more productivity. And in fact, sound sleep is sound business. But I'll come back to your question, though, which is a governmental one. I have been lobbying and been very vocal in every opportunity, and I'll take it here as well, to appeal to any first world nation that wants to work with me, because I have not yet seen any first world government that has issued a public health campaign regarding insufficient sleep. And it's puzzling because many of those countries have had wonderful public health movement conversations regarding eating, regarding exercise, regarding things like flu vaccination, regarding drink driving, drugs of abuse. Where is the missing piece in that puzzle? That is sleep. Sleep is the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of today, and it is not on the priority list of any government. They could make demonstrable changes that would save them as a government huge amounts of money. And I will give you a fact. The Rand Corporation, an independent survey group, looked at the enormous cost of sleep deprivation in many first world nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. In America, that was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In the United Kingdom, my home country, it was $50 billion. If you solve the sleep loss epidemic within countries, you could almost double the budget for education, or you could halve the healthcare deficit in some of these countries.
So let's open up some of the contradictions and conflicts with what you describe. If I walk into any airport around this world, one of the primary things they are attempting to sell to me, and look, I'm a guy who's approaching 50. I'm a yoga nut. I drink maybe one beer a month if I'm lucky. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm all that. I'm just saying that's what I'm describing. So look, if I walk into that airport, though, all I see are racks and racks and racks of brown, and I want to throw an expletive here, but I won't, but I see racks and racks and racks of brown liquor, right? And so all these people are buying this brown liquor. So even if we go out there, we have all these governments say, hey, here's the right way to do it. Then they go to the airport, they buy the bottle of brown liquor, they go home, they guzzle it down, and what happens to their sleep, Professor?
Well, alcohol is probably one of the most misunderstood drugs when it comes to sleep. It's commonly used as a sleep aid. Many people turn to alcohol when over-the-counter sleep aids fail for them. They think it helps them fall asleep more quickly. It doesn't. Unfortunately, alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. So all you're doing when you have a nightcap is actually just knocking out your brain, specifically the cortex, which sits on top of the brain. So firstly, you're not getting natural sleep when you're drinking alcohol, but then there are two other problems. Firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep throughout the night, so you wake up many more times. The problem is that they are so brief that they tend not to be remembered. But when you wake up the next morning, you feel lousy, you don't feel refreshed, you don't feel restored, but you never link two and two together because you don't remember waking up so much. If those two things weren't bad enough, unfortunately, and this makes me deeply unpopular, by the way.
No, not with me. Not with me. I don't drink, so.
But it's okay. For the most part, I'm an unpopular guy anyway, so I guess I'm already at floor levels. The final problem with alcohol with sleep is that it will actually block your REM sleep, or what we call your rapid eye movement sleep, which is essential for a number of brain functions, including creativity, insight, problem solving, as well as emotional and mental health. When you add all of those three things together, alcohol is a profoundly sleep disruptive drug. And if you want good sleep, it's to be abstained from. Of course, I don't want to be puritanical. Life, to some degree, is to be lived. But all I'm here to do is try to describe the science and what we know to be truth, and then allow people to make an informed choice with their behaviors.
Life is to be lived, but it's going to be a shorter life if everyone goes down some of these paths.
It is. And, I think, some of the comments I've sometimes had from media that I've done, people will say, well, yes, but if I'm sleeping just 6 hours a night versus 8 hours, I'm awake for 2 hours every day. Maybe I'll die at 60, but if I get 2 hours extra every day, then I'm still probably going to have just as much life as I would do if I slept 8 hours. Firstly, the problem with that is those years that you have lived are going to be more unhealthy. So you're going to have a shorter lifespan, but more importantly, you're going to have a shorter health span. The other thing is that, yes, you may be awake for longer, but you're also going to be largely in a stupor because you're so sleep deprived. So I don't think it's the type of quality, it would be like watching a YouTube that is, on 144 DPI. Why would you do that when you could watch it at 1080 high resolution? That's what a full 8 hours of sleep actually is.
I saw you on a national TV broadcast, a morning show. And it seemed to me, some of the questions, and one of the host was asking, he was older and he was asking some questions. And I just felt he felt so obligatory, like meaning, okay, we got the sleep guy here. Let's ask him some questions and move on to the next segment. I mean, there was just I guess I see your point where some people don't like what you're having to say, because I guess I've witnessed it in my own preparation for this conversation. So it's really amazing that people aren't more open-minded, because it's fascinating that once people go, like yourself, researchers go down this path, figure all this out, smart people should say, oh my gosh, this is great. Let's adopt this.
One of the potential problems here is that people become so used to feeling as though they are okay with 6 hours that they can't believe that they need more. But what's remarkable, I get this a lot on social media. People say, okay, I heard Matt speak and I decided to try the experiment. I tried getting, 8 hours of sleep opportunity every night. And my goodness, I never realized I could feel this way. So I think that's the first thing, this misbelief that 8 hours will actually give you something more than you're currently feeling, because you've reset your baseline into this kind of dull state of non-optimality, and you don't realize that you can be so much more. A lot of people say, well, this is just me at age 50. If you get 8 hours at age 50, you may actually start feeling 40. But I think the other problem, though, in terms of the pushback, is that sleep has an image problem. That in society in this day and age, we equate getting sufficient sleep with this concept of laziness, that if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, then you're slothful. It's surprising to me for at least two reasons. Firstly, human beings are the only species that will deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent good reason. And second, even we human beings don't always hold that attitude of sleep being useless, because no one looks at a baby sleeping during the day and says, well, what a lazy baby. And we don't, because we know that sleep at that time of life is non-negotiable. It's absolutely essential. But if you look at the data, somewhere now between infancy and even childhood, we abandon the notion that sleep is important and necessary and to be celebrated and embraced, and we chastise it and we stigmatize it with this label of laziness. And I think that that's a huge problem. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I face.
So Matthew, in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, all the rage has been the legalization of marijuana across various states. And I have smoked marijuana. When I was younger, I tried whatever, I just didn't like the feeling of smoke in my body, whether it's a cigarette or marijuana or whatever. But look, plenty of people do. And back to the alcohol point, what's marijuana doing to sleep? I mean, if everybody right now thinks it's wonderful that there's all these publicly traded companies and we could all make all this money buying marijuana, but everyone's stoned, what's happening to all those folks that think there's no ramifications to getting high on their sleep?
Marijuana does actually speed up the time it takes you to fall asleep. It's called your sleep onset latency, which just means how long does it take you to fall asleep? And people seem to fall asleep in a shorter amount of time. The problem, however, with marijuana is that, like alcohol, but through a different mechanism, it also seems to block rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep too. One of the problems there comes back to mental health issues. We and others have done studies where you will selectively deprive individuals of this thing called rapid eye movement sleep, which is otherwise known as dream sleep. And if you do that night after night, just selectively depriving them of rapid eye movement sleep, so they still sleep maybe 7.5 hours, but you've just prevented them from getting any dream sleep, because as soon as they go into dream sleep, we go into the room in the sleep center, we wake them up, and then they fall back asleep, we wake them up again. After about 3 or 4 days of that, people start to have hallucinations and delusions, and essentially they start to show signs of going into psychosis. They become psychotic, believing things that aren't true. They have paranoia, seeing things which are not there. You could imagine that if there is something like alcohol or marijuana that is routinely and chronically depriving your brain of REM sleep, it may heighten your risk for aspects of psychosis and mental health disorders. So I think it's one of those unspoken about dangers when it comes to those drugs. Now, we also don't know if some of the other variants of marijuana, looking at CBD oil, for example, some people use that, which doesn't necessarily have the euphoric sort of feelings that come along with classic marijuana. We don't know. what those things like CBD oil actually do to sleep and whether or not they are less disruptive. So could you still get some of the speeding up of the time that it takes you to fall asleep, but without the detrimental blocking of REM sleep? We don't know. That's unclear right now, but people should be aware of that.
Let me keep down the path of a couple more of these big picture issues that affect our sleep that we all really don't think about so much. And I think now, especially in the last 10 years, the age of the iPhone, and this one I'm guilty of. I am so guilty of this one, which is going to bed and feeling like I'm relaxing by sitting there at night and, checking something online on my phone or whatnot. Speak to me about what your research, all your hard work has taught us about this device usage at night, having too much light at night. And, I've had a lot of people come back to me and they want to talk about the blue light issue. Frame some of these topics together so that people can understand what you have learned.
So there are at least 3 ways that those gadgets will disrupt your sleep. The first is using them before sleep. For example, studies done where if you read on an iPad for 1 hour before bed, relative to just reading a book in dim light, the iPad will actually block the release of a critical sleep timing hormone called melatonin. And you need melatonin to rise in the evening to help tell your brain when it is time to fall asleep. And when it's at a high concentration, that's when your brain is instructed to get sleep, sort of time the onset of sleep. Well, if you're using those blue light devices, your brain is fooled into thinking it's still daytime. And so it puts the brakes on that hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is not released. And therefore, you're not going to feel sleepy. And in fact, it will delay the rise of that melatonin by up to 3 hours. So in other words, if I'm here in California, in Berkeley, and I read for an hour on my iPad, my peak melatonin, which should normally be present for me probably around about 10 o'clock in the evening, that's not going to arrive until 1 a.m. In other words, I'm now on Hawaii time. It puts me there in terms of a time zone. So that's the first problem with these devices, the blue light. It's actually light of all kinds, by the way. Blue light is especially damaging, but even just normal indoor lighting, I think the recommendation to people would be try turning down half of the lights in your house in the last hour before you go to bed. You may be surprised at how sleep enhancing and how tired and good your sleep becomes when you do that, and certainly doing away with the gadgets. The 2 other ways that these devices become problematic with sleep, the first is what we call sleep procrastination. It is a thing, which means that you get into bed, you've got your phone by your side or your iPad, and you're sleepy. You could fall asleep just fine, but you think, oh, I should maybe just check email one last time. I should just post on Twitter one last time, or I'll check Facebook, or I'll do Amazon, or those things quickly add up, and all of a sudden you look at the clock and now it's 30 minutes later and you've just lost half an hour of sleep. That sleep procrastination becomes a problem. The final thing is what we call anticipatory anxiety. Many people listening probably have had that feeling where if you've got a really early morning flight that is absolutely critical, let's say it's for a job interview and you've got to make that flight, you know for a fact that you're not going to sleep well the night before. You may fall asleep and stay asleep, but the depth of your sleep is just not as deep.
I hate this. It drives me crazy. This is the one I'm most guilty of.
It's an awful thing. But what happens when you leave your phone there, even if you're good and you put it into airplane mode, just that fact, because most people, if you look at the data, the first thing that most people do when they wake up in the morning, they swipe, they unlock, and then this world of anxiety comes flooding in. Emails, text messages, tweets, all of these things which ramp up the fight or flight branch of your nervous system, which is what causes anxiety and stress. Just knowing that that's what you have to look forward to each and every morning is a low-grade form of that early morning flight that is absolutely essential. And the studies have demonstrated that the depth of your sleep is not as deep when you're anticipating that anxiety the next morning. So those are the 3 ways that technology has been a problem in terms of the bedroom.
Switching back to the biology part here, I had a guest on this show years back named Sharon Moalim, and the subtitle of his book was How Our Genes Change Our Lives and How Our Lives Change Our Genes. Professor, the floor is yours to explain to people on a very, very micro level what's going on when we have this lack of sleep to our genes, our DNA.
That's perhaps some of the most frightening data that we've seen come out recently, which is that if increasing your risk for developing things like cancer or Alzheimer's disease were not sufficiently disquieting enough, we have since discovered that a lack of sleep will even erode the very fabric of biological life itself, which is your DNA genetic code. And in one study, they actually took a group of otherwise completely healthy adults and they limited them to 1 week of 6 hours of sleep. And then they measured the change in their gene activity profile relative to those very same subjects when they were getting 8 hours of sleep. And there were two critical findings. The first was that a sizable and significant 711 genes were changed in their activity caused by that insufficient sleep, which is relevant, by the way, not just in terms of its number, but also because of the sleep manipulation. We're not talking about total sleep deprivation here. A lot of people are trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. So this is a very, what I would say is ecologically relevant. In other words, it's relevant to most people's lives in terms of an experimental change. The second result perhaps was even more important. About half of those genes were actually suppressed in their activity. The other half were actually amplified in their activity. Those genes that were suppressed were genes that were related to numerous aspects of your immune system. So in other words, you start to become immune deficient at a genetic level by way of 6 hours of sleep for 1 week. Those genes that were actually amplified or over-exaggerated in terms of their expression were genes that were related to the promotion of tumors, genes that were associated with long-term chronic inflammation within the body, and genes that were associated with stress and, as a result, cardiovascular disease. I think, the take-home message for me from those types of findings is that many people in the public feel uncomfortable about the idea of, let's say, genetically modified food or even genetically modified embryos. But by choosing to get insufficient sleep, we now must all accept that we are performing a similar genetic modifying experiment on ourselves. And if we don't let our children get the sleep that they need, we are inflicting a similar genetic engineering experiment on them as well.
You mentioned we are choosing, and that was something that happened in my Facebook thread, is several people said, well, they kind of were saying, I'm not choosing this. I just can't get it. They weren't even allowing themselves to step back and say, hold on, let's do an inventory here. What is my routine and what's an optimal routine? And let's see if I can make some changes to get to the optimal routine. They weren't even considering that. It was just, I can't sleep well.
Yeah. And for some people, they may actually be, very good in terms of their dedication to an 8-hour sleep opportunity every night. But they may be suffering from, probably the second most common sleep disorder, which is, or probably actually it's probably the most common, which is insomnia. There are two forms of insomnia, one that we call sleep onset insomnia. The other is called sleep maintenance insomnia. They're not mutually exclusive. In other words, you find it difficult to fall asleep or you find it difficult to stay asleep. And those are hugely problematic. We know that the prevalence rates are somewhere between 12 to 15%. 1 out of every 10 people that you walk past on the street has clinical grade insomnia. And actually, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis because the threshold clinically to have a diagnosis of insomnia is very, very difficult. If you scale that back and relax the threshold a little bit, what we know is that 1 out of every 2 people, every 2 adults in most societies report struggling with their sleep at least once a week. Testament to that is the fact that here in America, in the last month, 10 million people will have swallowed some kind of sleep aid, which is, to me, just one of the most profound demonstrations of how desperate people are for sleep. Another way to phrase this is that, it took George Lucas with the Star Wars franchise, I think about 40 years to amass about 4 billion in profit in revenue generation. Well, it took Ambien less than 2 years to generate that same 4 billion in profit.
It's also blocking in other ways, not unlike alcohol and marijuana too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other conversation to have. And it was probably one of the most debated with my publishers chapters in the book. In the book, there is an entire chapter on sleeping pills and whether you should or should not take them. And I make some quite significant claims, but it's all backed up in the science. And the legal team released it. It was solid. What we firstly know is that sleeping pills, like alcohol, are also sedatives. They're called sedative hypnotics. And again, sedation is not the same as sleep. But we also know that the depth of the deep sleep that you get when you're on those drugs isn't the same. So you don't feel as refreshed. You can often feel groggy the next day. Perhaps what was more concerning and what caused the problems or concerns with the book was that there is now very good evidence that sleeping pills are associated with a significantly higher risk of death as well as cancer. And it is considerably higher. There was one study that looked at 20,000 controls versus 10,000 people taking sleeping pills. What they found was that if you are taking sleeping pills, you're about 3 to 4 times more likely to die across a 2.5-year period than those people who are not taking sleeping pills. It doesn't take much. Even just 5 pills to something like 30 pills a year still increased your death risk by almost 200%.
I don't know if I've ever had a conversation with someone, and I've seen some of your work already. It's the biggest PSA ever. I mean, it's like just amazing information. Look, I know you're not the only guy involved in the research, but you're a big leader right now, and it's just amazing. I mean, this should cause people to shake. Like, how did I not know this? Why are we not talking about this? Why do all my family members and friends not know about this? Everyone should know about this.
Yeah, and I think, that was what was heartwarming in reading a lot of the comments on the reviews of the book on websites like Amazon, etc., was how eye-opening it was for people and how they became essentially, sleep ambassadors themselves. They were just so struck, and they would say, I just can't stop telling everyone about this critical necessity of sleep. I'm buying the book for people. I'm sending them all of this information because when you understand, how essential it is, sleep is Mother Nature's best effort yet at immortality. It is the greatest healthcare system that you could ever wish for, and it is, for the most part, democratically available to everyone. And that's why I continue to fight for this thing called sleep. And I am so keen to reunite humanity with the sleep that it is so bereft of. Because, I don't want people to suffer. And I also know just economically, it makes a huge amount of sense. And I could give you one very easy, simple example. We know that if you are getting just 5 hours of sleep a night in the week before you get your flu shot, you will only produce about 50% of the normal antibody response, rendering that flu vaccination largely useless. And we know, for example, in America, that the flu costs the economy about $10 billion directly. It's about $100 billion indirectly, all told. If we could simply just get, by way of maybe sleep trackers and intelligent software, people sleeping sufficiently in the week before they get their flu shot, we could dramatically alter deaths as well as morbidity associated with every single flu season. And it would germinate productivity in the workplace because you're not losing those days of sickness.
Let me give you a kind of fun one in the middle of this conversation. So years ago, in my mid-20s, I was going down this path of having conversations and talking with masters of the universe traders on Wall Street. And I remember I went to this one guy's office in Stamford, Connecticut. His name was Mark, so if he's listening, hopefully he will laugh. I won't say his last name. But he was a big guy. He's like 6'5". We sat down, we had this nice conversation. He was so cool, gave me all these insights as a guy kind of coming along that really didn't know how any of this stuff worked. And he told me in the middle of our conversation that he had a process for working on new problems and learning. And he would take this, whatever he was working on with him, and he would lay down at night to go to bed, he'd be thinking about it, and he'd put a little piece of paper and a pencil next to his bed, and he would work on it while he slept, and then he would wake up in the morning and he'd write down notes or something. And I remember thinking, as like a 25, 26-year-old guy, I remember thinking, okay, I don't know how this all works. Okay, this guy's really, really smart. He's really successful, but this sounds really freaking nuts. This doesn't sound normal. And I remember thinking, like, okay, I don't know how to really, I don't know where to put this one. But, now I'm going through your work and I'm kind of like, you know what? I think I know where to put this.
Yeah, and there's a reason that you've never been told to stay awake on a problem. And we know from good scientific data that sleep can actually produce about a 3-fold increase in creativity and problem solving. These studies have been well performed. We've done a lot of these studies too on sleep and creativity. And there's lots of wonderful anecdotes to support that too. Musical anecdotes. We know that McCartney had some great compositions. Let It Be came to him in a dream. We know that Keith Richards would go to sleep with a cassette recorder and his guitar in his bed, and probably a lot of other things in his bed at the time as well. But let's set that aside for a second, because he knew that sleep could at some point just grip him with creative insight. And in fact, he reports in his autobiography that the opening chords to Satisfaction, the most famous Rolling Stones song, actually came to him in terms of dream-inspired insight. He said that, every night he would press record and then he would go to sleep. And the next morning he woke up and he rewound the tape. He played it back and he said, there in some ghostly image were the opening chords of Satisfaction that I'd played in the middle of the night, followed by about 43 minutes of snoring. But it did come to him, gifted by way of sleep. This idea that what sleep, and specifically it seems to be dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, dream sleep is a form of informational alchemy. It's during dream sleep that the brain takes all of the recently learned information and then starts to collide it and intersect it with all of your back catalog of information. So you start to test out new associations, you start to seek new connections, and you wake up with a revised mind-wide web that is capable of divining incredible ideas and solutions to previously impenetrable problems.
Let me take you to something else that happened in my thread. And I had one guy that was trying to make the case that younger people literally don't need the sleep. And you have done some work and you've put some studies together, perhaps other research too that you've brought in and aggregated. The school start time, that one is one of those aha moments that should cause parents to just go, oh my God, OMG, as they might say in Saigon, Vietnam, Troy, oi. It's one of those ones. And talk about the school start time and connect it with some of the research on the SATs.
So I think in 10 or 15 years' time, we will look back and we will be desperately ashamed about the earliness of school start times, because the data is fast accumulating, and I think it is now unequivocal. One of the earliest studies that looked at this happened in America, in Minnesota, and they shifted their school start times from 7:25 to 8:30 in the morning. And the first thing to note, by the way, about that is, what are we doing trying to educate our next generation at 7:25 in the morning? It's clearly not a good idea, because for a 7:25 start, school buses will begin leaving at 5:30 in the morning, which means that some kids are having to wake up at 5:15 or 5 o'clock or even earlier, which to me is utter lunacy. But to get back to the study, they looked at the SAT scores. In the year before they made the time change, when kids were going to school at 7:25 in the morning, the average SAT score of the top performers was 1,288, which it turns out is a very respectable score. The following year, when they were going to school at 8:30 in the morning, the average SAT score was 1,500, which is a 212-point increase. In other words, that will dramatically change which tier of university those kids go to, and as a consequence, their ultimate life trajectory. I think people have questioned some aspects of that early study, perhaps for good reason. But in all of the subsequent studies that we've done, the data now, I think, is very clear. Academic grades increase, behavioral problems decrease, truancy rates also decrease. And then we also see psychiatric and psychological problems. They too also decrease dramatically.
It's just one of these things where when you start to wrap your mind around how many of these different variables that we are in control over, that we mess up on, and how it affects our lives. I mean, look, here's another one, daylight savings time. I currently am in a culture, a country that doesn't operate with it, so the time changes. But if I'm in this country for a year, then 6 months of the year, I'm plus 11 hours East Coast US, and 6 months of the year, I'm plus 12. Daylight savings time, pretty much from what I can tell from your work, is not a good thing.
It can be a killer, unfortunately. Well, and I think daylight savings time is probably the largest global sleep experiment that happens. It's performed essentially on 1.6 billion people across about 70 countries twice a year, of course. And what you find if you look at the data is in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, there is a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks. But in the autumn, in the fall, when we gain an hour of sleep, there's a 21% reduction in heart attacks as a result. So I think that's how vulnerable our bodies are to even just 1 hour of lost sleep across one single night, let alone several hours of lost sleep across weeks, months, if not years.
As we wind down here, Matthew, I want to bring it back to something we talked about at the very beginning. We were talking about testosterone. We were talking about men. And you brought up the numbers talking about what happens in terms of your testosterone production going down. But I've seen you make the case in public too. It's also a size issue. Literally, there is a testicle size issue going on with a lack of sleep. Why don't you really get very graphic there so my male friends out there can perhaps even wrap their arms around this even more?
Yeah, not only is a lack of sleep going to sort of be emasculating at the level of testosterone, but men who sleep 5 to 6 hours a night do have significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 8 hours or more. We also know that they have more deformities in terms of their sperm. And it's not just men, by the way. It's also, we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by insufficient sleep. And that's why, from a very non-humor perspective, if you have a young couple that's trying to conceive, but they're both not getting sufficient sleep, that's a very difficult challenge because of these demonstrable changes in the reproductive system caused by a lack of sleep.
Hey, one last thing too. This is really, I think, a really important one for people to consider. Statistics is a very difficult subject for people. And when I posted this comment, somebody came back and they said, well, look at this guy, David Wells. He was a pitcher for the Yankees. He was very overweight and he would go out and party every night. And he pitched a perfect game, and he said, 3 or 4 hours sleep or something. And so this person comes onto my, Facebook and says, well, look at David Wells. Look at this example. And I think people really need to grasp the idea of a bell curve and not just go hunting. And you've already said this in this podcast, not just go hunting for that extreme outlier, because if everyone imagines themselves being the outlier, then it's just illogical. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, outliers, are usually used for confirmation bias to support your own, predilection. And that's always dangerous. You should always just be open to the data. And I think with sleep, one of the other issues to keep in mind too is that the number of people who can, well, actually, let me say it this way. A lack of sleep is going to get you one way or another, and it can get you acutely or it can get you chronically. One way that lack of sleep will pop you out the gene pool and end your life very quickly is drowsy driving. We know that insufficient sleep causes more car accidents than either drugs or alcohol combined. And we know that is far more deathly as well as a consequence. The reason is because when you have what's called a micro sleep behind the wheel, where you just the brain essentially just falls into a sleep state for just a second or two, at that point, you tend to make no reaction at all to an accident potential event. Whereas when you're drunk or you're intoxicated, you're just making an action that is too late, but you're still making an action. That's why insufficient sleep is much more deathly from a road traffic accident perspective. So firstly, if you're bragging about, maybe outliers or, people may be able to get away with it for one day in terms of driving, but it can get you acutely in that way. The other thing, though, is chronically. That's how a lack of sleep will ultimately impact most people. And a good example here is hypertension. A lot of people don't know that they have high blood pressure, and they can be doing the wrong things for year after year after year. And they say, well, look, I'm smoking and I drink and, I kind of eat lousy food, but look at me. I'm strong as an ox and I'm still standing here in front of you. But then 10 years later, they suffer a massive coronary or they die of a brain hemorrhage because of a stroke due to that hypertension. It's the same way with sleep. You don't know you're not getting sufficient sleep when you're not getting sufficient sleep. You're not aware of it, but it will get you, unfortunately. The elastic band of sleep deprivation will stretch only so far before it snaps.
I got to share with you really quick, really fun little story I did when I was like 20 years old. I was driving from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. It's about a 20-hour drive. I didn't know anything about how sleep would affect my body or whatnot. So I figured, okay, I'll try to sleep during the day and I'll start driving at 11 o'clock at night. I'll take a bunch of Vivarin, I thought, okay, I can just drive all the way through the night to get to New Orleans. I got to about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and I was passed out in my car on the side of the road. So,
well, and that's the right thing to do. It's just not worth it. Either you could lose your own life or you could take someone else's life.
The book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. Matthew, where's the best place beyond Amazon where people should go buy this book? This is one of those books that you should, I actually just bought 3 copies for my family and just sent it to them. Where should people go to check you out? Where's the best place beyond a Google search? They can find you everywhere. But is there a website?
I do. I have a website and I'm on social media and it's all Sleep Diplomat. So I'm on Twitter at Sleep Diplomat. I'm on the web. sleepdiplomat.com. The same thing in terms of LinkedIn. So people will find me there, unfortunately or fortunately.
You've sure picked a topic that I think most rational people, most rational people, I'm not sure. Calling humans rational is smart. But for most rational people out there, this is one of those topics that's pretty universal. So, hey, listen, I appreciate the work and best of luck and can't wait to see all the new things you figure out in the years to come.
Thank you so much and a privilege to be on the show, Mike. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.